Welcome to Seek Travel Ride. This is the podcast where we share the stories of people who have embarked on epic adventures by bike. From touring cyclists exploring the world to bikepackers tackling remote trails, each episode is packed with inspiration and tips to fuel your own cycling dreams. I'm super thrilled to announce a major milestone. Episode 100 is just around the corner. To celebrate, we've teamed up with our amazing show sponsor, Old Man Mountain, to bring you an exciting giveaway. Old Man Mountain racks are the ultimate gear solution for adventurers, designed to perform wherever your bike takes you. Whether you're on gravel trails or the open road, their commitment to quality makes them the perfect partner for Seek Travel Ride. And to celebrate our 100th episode milestone, they have donated an amazing prize consisting of 2 racks, 2 sets of panniers, a trunk bag and an Old Man Mountain fit kit. They will fit whichever bike you choose to take on your own adventure, and the giveaway is happening over at our Instagram. Make sure to check us out at Seek Travel Ride. You can find out all the details on how you can enter for your chance to win that amazing prize pack. Now let's get into the show and stoke your wanderlust for bike adventures.
It was the first time on the trip when I was really getting into the middle of nowhere, like these huge flat landscapes, like a straight road that just disappears into a pinpoint in the distance. And this is what I mean by the uniqueness of Central Australia. It's just to have that sense of spaciousness and to like look at those huge skies and just feel like there's no buildings, there's barely any trees, there's nothing on the horizon that tells you how far away stuff is. And I remember like putting the bike down on the middle of that road and looking back at the bicycle and just going, wow, I am here. So this thing I'd been dreaming about for so very long, now I'm actually out here doing it, and it's not just as good as I hoped it would be, it's even better.
Welcome to the Seek Travel Ride podcast, where we share the stories and experiences of people who have undertaken amazing adventures by bike. Whether it's crossing state borders, mountain ranges, countries or continents, we want to share that spirit of adventuring on 2 wheels with our listeners. Hello, I'm your host Bella Malloy, and I'm really excited to introduce my guest for today's episode of Seek Travel Ride, David McCourt. Originally from Northern Ireland, in 2022, David set out from Melbourne, Australia, on a 2.5-year journey to ride his bike all the way back to his home village of Cushendall. David aptly called this ride the long way home, and his trip had an extra sense of purpose as he also chose to fundraise during the ride for the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre. Now, this cycle tour took him through some of the world's most unique landscapes and challenging regions. From the vast Australian outback, vibrant cultures of Southeast Asia, the bustling streets of India and Pakistan, up through those mountainous Himalayas and across the historical routes of Central Asia and Europe. Of course, a solo bike tour like this also brings with it the experiences at both ends of the emotional spectrum. For every dreamy landscape and picturesque mountain peak, there's also the reality of dealing with challenges which need to be overcome to maintain our forward progress. Things like illness, injury, inclement weather, border crossings and challenging terrain, they all play their part in making this a true adventure. So I'm looking forward to exploring the highs and the lows of such a long and demanding journey with David today. From the solitude of the open road to the moments of deeper connection with people across different countries, across continents, and everything in between. I've no doubt David's got some remarkable stories and insights to share with us, and I think just like me, you're all going to enjoy hearing about what it's really like to tackle such an adventure one day at a time and take the long way home. David McCourt, welcome to the show.
Hello, Bella, and hello, folks. Thank you all for having me.
David, I am super excited for this show today. I've been watching your journey play out through your amazing photo journal. But, David, a question I start my show with, and I ask this of all my guests, is, David, do you remember the very first bike you ever rode?
Oh, that is a good question. I actually probably don't remember the bike specifically, but if it had to be some time in my childhood, probably some sort of tricycle or something like that. I do have a memory of going on a bike ride probably when I was about 13. And I think it was just 10, 12 kilometers from my village in Cushendall towards my secondary school, and it nearly killed me. Like, and fast forward literally probably, let's say 10, 12 years to sometime in my 20s, my good friend Tom Mackey, he did a bike ride around Australia. In fact, that was the very initial seed of inspiration for my trip. And I cycled with him the very last day of his ride from Kensington to Sunbury. That was where he started and finished his trip. And that was about 35K. And that almost killed me. To that point in my life, so I'd say my early 20s, I didn't do a lot of cycling, actually. It's quite bizarre.
You know, when you were saying about that first ride when you were 12 or 13 years old from Cushendall, that would be taking in the beautiful Antrim coast there as well.
Absolutely. The coastal road, the Causeway coastal route that follows the coastline all the way to, I guess you could say finishes up in Larne. But that was just where I grew up, and as happens when you grow up in a beautiful place, I think for a lot of us, we just end up taking it for granted. And it's only now that I live in Australia and I live in Melbourne, when I go back to my village, like as of most recently, like you just go, holy smokes, this place is incredible.
Yeah, and I mean, the Antrim coast is incredible. And I often wonder how many people don't really think of the north of Ireland in that way. I'm really fortunate, listeners. My lovely husband's family actually comes from Northern Ireland, so I've been there and I've actually seen the coastline when you are. And actually, David, I've got a hilarious Cushendall story for you quickly. The very first time I went there, we were doing like a big day on the road. We were visiting my beautiful father-in-law's area where he would have grown up, his school. We went out to, I think, Tor Head, although I think maybe Cushendall we might have hit before then. But anyway, by the time we got into Cushendall, I was really, really busting for a pee. and I saw, oh, great, stop the car, there's toilets there, I'm going to go. And I got to these toilets and they were all locked. And my heart had sank, because I don't know if you've ever been busting before and you see a toilet and you think relief is on its way. And then it's like, no, it's taken away from you. And I bumped into this lovely guy who was around looking at me puzzled and he goes, what's wrong? And I said, the toilets, yeah, they're locked. He goes, sure, they've been closed for years. And I've said that in a horrible Northern Irish accent, and I hope that I didn't insult you there. But I was just like, so that is my memories of Cushendall. when I heard that you were from there, I was like, hang on, is that the toilet place? So I'm sure it's known for many beautiful things other than that, though, right?
Absolutely. But did the fella not offer you? Did he not say, come on round to my house, you can do a pee there, or what?
He didn't. He definitely didn't. And in fact, imagine if you're related to him. I did a wild pee in some long grass near the beach. So
Fair enough. Absolutely.
Unlike Australia, I didn't have to watch out for any snakes in the long grass, though, so that was good. That's a cool part of Ireland, no snakes there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, too, living in Australia now, when I meet people on the road and I tell them I live in Australia, one of the first things they often say is, oh, what about all the snakes and the spiders and all that sort of stuff? And as you know, it's really not that big a deal. When I think of that sort of thing, it's more when I think of places where they actually still have apex predators, like a North American continent where you have bears running around that could literally eat you.
Yeah.
And I know they're not everywhere, but like it's certainly a concern when you're going into the bush. Like it's a completely different story. Or mountain lions or cougars, things that will potentially attack you. Obviously, in the north of Australia, you got crocodiles, and that's something to be aware of. But it's not like just walking around the place. There are big animals that are sometimes intended on eating you.
Yeah, exactly. Although I must say, having been away from Australia for a while, when I come back, I always have to remind myself not to just walk through really long grass.
I was hiking in Tasmania over the long weekend just recently, and we did come across a couple of pretty big brown snakes. And you're just walking along the bush, and they literally look like sticks. And it's only until that, I guess, really primal instinct kicks in, you're like, oh, stop, because you could literally step on them. And they're not the longest, but they're very chunky. Like they weren't small snakes by any measure. And my friend Tom, who was the same fellow I mentioned before, we were hiking together down in the Tasman Peninsula. He's pretty good in this stuff, and he was like, "Yeah, they're definitely brown snakes." So
give them a wide berth. So you took this journey to go back to Cushendall, that home village of yours. But how long had you been in Australia beforehand? Like it wasn't a case that you'd left as a baby, but you'd also hadn't left as an adult. You'd spent some of your time growing up in Ireland, right?
Yeah, so I moved to Australia when I was 17, and this May it will be 20 years that I've been in Australia with my family. Yeah, nearly 2 decades here. And an interesting time to make that transition, because when you're a bit younger, maybe it's less of a big deal because you're still very much a kid. But I was at that transition period of going from like secondary school into like young adulthood. So it was definitely hard. I think hardest for me out of me and my three siblings. But it's definitely a move that none of us regret. Like Australia is truly home now. And I have the advantage of having my family here in Australia too. So mum, dad, and then two brothers and sister that I'm the oldest of. Whereas a lot of other people, say from Ireland and Europe that come to Australia, they might just be coming by themselves and don't have that next of kin support that I would have. And the other side of it was being able to go into secondary school in Australia, high school as you guys call it, for at least a year and a half. That meant then I had the opportunity to make friends in school as opposed to just diving straight into uni. I still have lifelong friends, again, including that fella Tom. I met him at secondary school in Australia, and I've got other friends from high school that I still hang out with.
Yeah, and conversely, do you still have high school friends from Cushendall that you've kept in touch with a bit and would have revisited when you went back?
Absolutely. And so anytime I do go home, I have this small list of names of people that I want to catch up with. And that includes the lads I used to knock around with back in Northern Ireland. It's funny, like in my head, it's as it was when I left, but they've all went their separate ways as well. They still know each other. And it's funny, sometimes it's when I come home that they actually see each other for the first time in a long time as well. People have just gone on their own paths through life. It's always been very important to me to maintain that connection with home because I consider Ireland still to be home in addition to Australia, which is also home for me now. I absolutely adore going back to Cushendall, and it always does feel like this mad rush of seeing people, and but that's also part of the joy. People often ask me, would you move home to Ireland again? And the answer is no. It's probably the stage of life that I'm at, but also what I want from life. As much as I love Northern Ireland and Ireland in general, if I'm going to move anywhere away from Australia again, it would be I've got two bits of criteria. One where they don't speak English as the first language, because I would absolutely love to really properly learn another language. And then the other is a place with big mountains. And Ireland doesn't really have either of those. So if I was to move to Europe, for example, it would probably be one of the Alps countries like France or Germany or Italy or something like this, or somewhere else around the world where you have that access to the big mountains.
Well, I've got to say, David, my home's in the French Pyrenees, so it's not the Alps, but I live somewhere where they don't speak English and there's big mountains.
Thank you very much, and I'll keep that in mind. And I was so stoked to visit the Pyrenees because I'd always been to the Alps, but never actually got down to that part of the world. And my original route was going to take me up through northwest France. So I was going to exit the European continent from Cherbourg or Le Havre or something like that and take a ferry across either to England or directly to Ireland. And then the way things worked out, because I had people to see, my friends Peter and Pri, who lived in France, and it meant, long story short, we were able then to meet in the south of France instead, and I could exit the European continent via Bilbao in Spain.
Yeah, so you took the ferry across then to Cork? Would you have gone to Cork?
No, to Rosslare down in Wexford. Yeah.
Oh, just think, David, there's a slight small chance that, unknown to us, maybe we even passed on the road.
Quite possibly.
Although, no, listeners, you should know, Bella, if I see a bike traveller on the road, I'm giving you a big wave and probably coming out and finding out your story.
There are a dime a dozen in France, wouldn't you say? There's a lot of people with panniers.
Oh, my goodness. And if you're on any of like the Eurovelo routes, there's heaps and heaps there as well.
Yeah.
All right, let's get back into your journey though, David. So you were motivated by your friend's story, his ride around Australia, but you weren't a bike rider. And I think this is something I've noticed with a lot of guests is it's wrong to presume that people that go on big long-term cycle journeys that go across years would even label themselves as a cyclist. Would I be right to put you into that bracket?
Yes and no. So meeting my friend Tom, so as I said, he did a lap of Australia by bike, basically the outside of the country. And I flew up to meet him in Darwin at the halfway point. And we had these plans to visit Kakadu National Park in Litchfield and get into a bit of the Northern Territory bush and see all this good stuff. But the truth of the matter is, we caught up in Darwin. I saw this guy, my friend, with this big dirty beard, a tan line, like a t-shirt tan line that, like a real sharp line on his arms. And I just got chatting to him. And I'd actually myself had just returned to Australia from a university placement in Slovenia. So I'd spent 3 months in Slovenia. And so seeing Tom again was so great just to catch up, but then also to just hear his stories. And it blew my mind because I was already keen on traveling from certainly my earliest teenage years. I had this yearning to go overseas and explore other places. My father, he was in the Merchant Navy. He left his hometown of Larne when he was 16 to basically go to sea college and then jump on oil tankers and other things like that and travel all around the world. One of my earliest childhood friends, he moved to South Korea with his family when he was in primary 2. And he used to come home every summer and he would tell me stories of living in South Korea, going to this international school. And that just really got my thirst going for seeing other places. But it was then seeing Tom in Darwin and hearing the bike side of it that really got the bike element of it going. Because again, at that stage, I wasn't cycling. And so I laughed because we had plans, as I say, to go to these national parks. And instead, have you been to Darwin?
No, I haven't, but I feel like I've travelled there through other people's stories, and I'm looking forward to travelling there with yours. Go on.
So I don't know if this pub is still here, but there's an Irish pub, of course, called Shenanigans on Mitchell Street. We thought we'd go there for a couple of beers on the first day, and we ended up going back there every day for like a week straight. It wasn't a big piss up. What it actually was is just like lots of conversations. Like Tom was just telling me all these incredible stories he had. Just hearing it, because already having done a little bit of traveling myself at that stage, the bike traveling seemed to open up a whole new world to you. One story I'll never forget is, and I'm not sure where it was, but Tom ended up in some fairly remote pub somewhere in the bush, and as often would be the case, left the bike at the front. It's a great conversation starter if you have a fully loaded, especially somewhere out there where most people are getting there by car. And one beer led to many beers, and the next day Tom wakes up kind of thinking, oh, that night kind of got away from me. He ended up staying with somebody, some man that invited him home. He was like, I need to get back to the pub because I left my bike there last night. He had a vague recollection of doing that. I think it was a farmer that he ended up staying with. The guy was like, oh, we'll just fly back on the plane. And I was like, what do you mean a plane? And this farmer had like a crop duster plane. So he literally took him back to the... So I don't know how they'd got home. I hope they didn't fly in a plane. I don't know what... I don't know. Actually, I need to revisit this story with Tom. But I just thought, what? So you met some guy who then flew you back to the pub? Just stories like that made me think, right, okay, there's something to this. Because when you're like a typical backpacker, and especially in this day and age where so much is revealed to you online before you even get there, the path is so well trodden, at least the stuff we hear about, it's such a different style of travel. And I think tourism, for the good and the bad, definitely changes the dynamic with the local people. If you get to these places in the earlier days when it isn't so commercialized and when it isn't so well known, the type of interactions you're going to have with people are going to be very different to, say, let's go to Thailand today as opposed to 30 years ago. And they say the same thing about Vietnam. Vietnam is like the Thailand of 15 years ago or something like this. And so the beauty of bike travel, as I came to learn, was that you invariably go to the places that are in between, because you're not flying, you're not taking a bus or a train, you're getting there under your own steam, and you need to stop for water and food, and you'll end up in the little village. So even if you're in Thailand, for example, where it is ultra touristy, you'll still end up in this village in the middle of nowhere that nobody ever comes to because it's not in the most beautiful place in the world. And you might end up having a chat with the guy selling bananas or the lady in the restaurant, and then something beautiful happens as a consequence of that. And so that for me really actually nails one of the reasons why I love bike touring so very much.
One of the beautiful things about this show, David, apart from guaranteed 100%, every time I finish an interview, I just want to put stuff on my bike and go. like the wanderlust is strong, listeners, but I also get the joy of having people who listen to the show contact me, telling me they're listening because they're inspired to take their own adventures. And it's through people like you sharing these amazing stories. You know, when you talked about the idea that everything's available to us online now, we can almost visit a place before we've been there, learn about it. What about then when it came to the idea to take this trip and a route that you would take? With the benefits of looking back at what you've done, was your idea when you set off, does it map out with reality of where you actually ended up going?
Sort of is the answer. So as far as route planning went, I knew that I had some places within Australia. In fact, most of the route through Australia I knew I wanted to do. So there were some big ticket items like heading down the Great Ocean Road, following that coastal route into South Australia, then getting onto the Mawson Trail, which you've probably heard of.
Oh, yeah. It's on a bucket list for me.
Yeah, it is wonderful, especially the northern part that takes you through the Flinders Ranges. Absolutely magic. Then the Oodnadatta track. So me and the same fella Tom, that was actually my first bike touring adventure. He had the crazy idea to tackle the Oodnadatta track in December, which in retrospect, it was just friggin' nuts because it was so hot. Stupidly hot. And that was like a 1,200 or 1,300 kilometer ride from, we started in Quorn, which is sort of central South Australia, I think, and then end up pulling off the track because we actually got rained off. And the Oodnadatta track, when it's dry, it's fine, especially these days. But when it rains, the bull dust just makes it turn to absolute crap and you're going nowhere. In fact, we got stranded in a outback town called William Creek over New Year's Eve. It was wonderful, really, to be stuck in a place like that with other travelers who also couldn't go anywhere and ring in the new year in this place, which is literally in the middle of nowhere. So after the Oodnadatta track, I wanted to get out to Uluru, Katajuda, and then do the Marini loops. So getting through Watarka, so known as Kings Canyon, and then all that sort of good stuff like the mountains that run west to east through Alice Springs. Then the Tanami track that heads through the Tanami Desert northwest out of Alice Springs. And the last section, which I didn't do, and you know why,
I do.
we'll talk about this, was
We will.
the Gibb River Road. So I didn't get to do that part through the Kimberley. So that was the part I knew I wanted to do. Beyond that, what I literally did was I took a screen grab of Google Maps from Australia to Northern Ireland, took a screen grab, and then I drew a line. I drew a line with paint. And I had countries that I knew I wanted to hit. So Iran, Central Asia, India, Nepal. I did have a very strong desire to go back to the Annapurna circuit in Nepal because I hiked that about 8 years before the trip. And I actually met a guy on a bicycle there, this German dude with a grizzly beard, and a bamboo bicycle of all things too. And I was like, what? I had no idea you could cycle this. And the truth is, you can and you can't cycle it. There's a lot of pushing, put it that way. But I did. I said to myself, when I do this trip, because the seed had already been planted for me to do a big trip, a big bike ride, and I returned there on the bike. But really, outside of Australia, it was super, super flexible. And I knew that I would just basically decide where I was going to go as I was traveling rather than like say, I have to do this. And for such a long trip, I think anybody else who's done one would agree. There's no point in trying to plan it to the nth degree. And I'm definitely not a planner. I'm just, anybody who knows me is I'm more of a doer, sometimes to my detriment. I plan a little bit too little, but it usually works out. And at the very least, I have a lot of fun.
It's something that I've learnt from interviewing people on the show, David, is the notion that it will work out, that you will find a way. The other thing I always think about is the most important thing to pack on a long distance bike journey is that idea of flexibility, because you can't have a plan that's going to stick to the plan on a tour this long. You have to be flexible to change tack, don't you?
Absolutely. And I was very happy then to learn about the places I should check out from other bike tourists or other travelers or other local people along the way. And they say, oh, have you heard of this thing? Go there. And so that's kind of how I did it.
I've got to go, and we'll go to the reasons why you didn't cycle the Gibb River Road, but is there a part of you that yearns to go and do that little missing section?
Oh, absolutely. And the gift is that I live in Australia. So having gone across the world over that 2.5-year journey and experienced some incredible places and the world, this is the absolute beauty of where we live. This planet has so much variety and so much to see and do. But I live in Australia, a country that many people from around the world pay a lot of money to come visit. And it's a huge place. It's a continent, really. And there's so much diversity there. And I'm so stoked to know that I live here because I can still experience it at relatively little cost and without having to fly half around the world and all the environmental stuff associated with that. But I have to say, some of my most cherished memories of the trip are still when I look back in Central Australia. It's so unique. Now, I'm not saying Australia is the only place where you have like massive stretches of wilderness, but there's something really special about especially Central Australia. I'm talking the outback. I'm thinking of like the Tanami track, these huge, and if anybody, have you been on the Unadilla track or any of this sort of stuff?
I haven't, but actually just quickly, the Tanami track, I was reading, I think they're paving it now.
That's right. So get on it sooner than later if you want to do it while it's still a track. It's paved until Yuendamu, which is the last settlement before you actually get on it properly. And this was also the most remote place I visited on my journey. So from the first settlement to the next settlement, it was 600 kilometers from Yuendamu to Billy-Luna, 2 indigenous places.
When you say you don't plan, you just do. You have to plan for that stretch. So
yeah.
there is planning that takes place there. First question, obvious one, how much water were you taking on at the start of that 600 kilometre stretch?
So within Australia, I knew water was going to be more critical than anywhere else I travelled. So I had a carrying capacity of up to 23 litres, a few different bladders, and then lots of bottles around the bike. So that's 23 kilograms of water alone. I had enough food for, I think, 8 or 9 days, which is pretty easy to manage, really. Just need some carbs and then ability to cook it, so enough gas for that. When I left Yuendamu, I knew that there was 2 mines on the road on that 600 kilometre stretch. I was pretty confident that one of the mines was going to be open. I wasn't so sure about the other mine, but really what I was depending on was, because 23 litres is nowhere near enough to get you through.
No, I was going to say that's not enough anyway.
And this road is corrugated. This is like 1,000 kilometers of nasty corrugation, sometimes quite sandy, quite gravelly, so it's very slow going. Yeah, couple that with a hot headwind, like you're really...
It's always a headwind.
Yeah, well, that's another thing. With the wind, like, it's just part of cycling, just like the hills, and people can gripe about it, and it's character building for sure, but the way I would think about it, as any other bike tourists out there, probably yourself included, would think, you have a lot of conversations with yourself. And I would say to myself, regardless of what the wind is, especially when it wasn't a headwind, sometimes there will be crosswinds, sometimes there will be tailwinds, sometimes there'll be no wind, and sometimes you get a headwind. Just try and accept them all with grace. Because when you're fanging along the road, as I often was, I didn't actually have that, considering I was on the road for 2.5 years, I didn't have that many days of horrendous headwinds, but when you did, you really notice them. And I was just like, well, I would say to myself, and I would say to the wind, welcome back to the party. Welcome back to the adventure. Yeah, thanks. It's good to have you. And almost like make a person out of it, because it was just another element of the adventure that was really outside of your control. So it's up to you to decide, well, how am I going to deal with this?
Back to your story, was the other mine open, and how did you manage more water?
Yeah. So it was. In fact, both mines were open. And my strategy for water was, so I was going through this region in the Australian winter. And at that time of year, there's a lot of four-wheel drives and sometimes even people pulling four-wheel drive or off-road caravans. So I was basically depending on traffic for water. It's a measured risk, really, but I always saw at least one car per day, if not multiple. And they would always stop too, because you're out in the middle of nowhere. And if they see a bicycle, they're like, all right, let's just check on this person. So I was really depending on the generosity of others. And I think that's what a lot of people would do when they're tackling the Tanami. There is sometimes a water tank. Well, there's a water tank that has sometimes got water in it. And it didn't for my adventure through there. So I stopped at the mine and they were super nice. They gave me lots of water. They even gave me all these like frozen electrolytes. What do you call them? The
Super dupers and stuff
yeah,
like that.
it was like an electrolyte super duper, and it was so nice because you're getting a bit of the salts and whatnot and the sugar, but then it's cold and delicious. And here's the thing: the other beautiful thing about being on a bike in the outback is you'll occasionally get a Coke or a beer. Like they'll take a bit of pity on you, and like when that happens, I remember when I was doing that initial ride with my mate Tom on the Unadata track, and every now and again somebody would just swing over and then say, "Do you need any water?" I'm okay, or yes or no kind of thing. And then, "Do you want a beer?" And it's like, "Yes, please." And it's the most amazing thing to receive.
Who needs water when there's beer?
This is the thing, like, you play these mind games, I guess, in society, and when you're back in the big city, it's nothing to have a beer. You can just go to the shop, you get a beer or a Coke or whatever it is, and you just got it. But when you're out in the middle of nowhere and the prospect of having something like that is literally hundreds of kilometers away sometimes, when someone out of nowhere just gives you one, you appreciate it so very much more than you would otherwise.
Especially on a remote section like that. I can picture the corrugations and I can imagine the heat. But if you were there in winter, well, you would have been experiencing cold, right?
I was in the early stages of the trip, so it was pretty horrendous going up the Great Ocean Road in wintertime. I think lots of rain and wind. As they say in the motherland, wind that would cut you in two. So it was pretty miserable at the start, but once I started heading north inland from South Australia, from Adelaide, basically, the rain subsided and it was pretty chilly, especially I remember that had like ice on the outside of the tent in the Flinders Ranges. It was interesting doing the Tanami because it was like being in an oven and someone was slowly turning up the temperature. Over just a matter of days, it went from being quite cold at nighttime and nice during the day to being really quite hot. And by the time I popped out the other end on the Great Northern Highway, it was cooking. Now it was up to like 40 degrees. So it was definitely getting higher.
I had this as a question for you later, specifically when I was going to talk about Southeast Asia, but it's just natural to come up now, David. Like, how does a Northern Irishman deal with heat like that? And then in Southeast Asia, heat and humidity. How are you managing to deal with that type of heat?
The short answer is not well. I am not built for these climates, as you very well know. Like the north of Ireland does not experience. And saying that, we have a lot of humidity, it's the opposite problem though, because Ireland is not extremely cold. It's just a bit miserable a lot of the time. And again, as people in the north would say, it gets into your bones. So even though it's not extremely cold temperatures, because it's so damp, it can be it's a cold that just gets into you. But that's the climate I'm used to. And I'm slowly adjusting to having lived in Australia for 20 years where you get extremes in Melbourne too. But as far as the heat goes, and especially the humidity, it's really hard to cope with that. Just like any aspect of the trip, you just got to learn to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. It was most intense, though, I got to say, in North India. I didn't time it very well getting through North India. I was there in summertime, and so it was absolutely killer conditions. So think 35 plus degrees, 70 to 80% humidity. I was starting riding, so I was waking up at 3 a.m. to start riding at 4 a.m. to try and stop riding by 11 a.m. Even at 4, it was yucky conditions, and even by like 9:30, 10 a.m., it was killer. Like North India was really, really hellish conditions. But another way to manage it, depending on where you are, so again, anybody who's toured through Southeast Asia, particularly Thailand, you basically leapfrog from one 7-Eleven to the next, get inside, get a bit of aircon. They usually have these ice machines in the back somewhere, and I would just fill my water bladder with ice and then fill it with water, and you have like ice cold water for the next 45 minutes. And there's probably going to be another 7-Eleven there anyway. So that helped a lot as well.
You are right about the humidity and the heat there. And conversely, having experienced Irish weather myself, though someone in Ireland told me once, David, and you'll probably agree with this, if you don't like the weather, just wait 15 minutes because it'll change, because it's forever changing as well.
Absolutely. They talk about Melbourne having 4 seasons in one day. I wouldn't say you get the 4th season of summer in Ireland in one day, but it will be raining 1 minute and the next it'll be dry. And we have these skiffs. We have this bands of rain coming in off the Atlantic, and it can wear you down because especially in like the depths of winter, January, February can be quite a dark time because the days are super, super short. So you wake up in the dark and you come home from school or work in the dark, and it is just cold, wet, and miserable. So
you know what I remember though is I don't think I've seen as many rainbows as I ever did in Ireland.
Yeah.
Feel like the rainbows were just ever present there.
Yeah, especially with a lot of wet weather. And the other thing about it, though, is, again, it's about scarcity, I think. Just like I was talking about with the Coke or the beer in the middle of nowhere in Central Australia, in Ireland, when you do get a nice day, it is heaven on earth because you're just like, wow. And when I've had nice weather, and I was very lucky when I was there to have some very nice weather, in fact, after a very miserable summer, I just think, why did I ever think that weather was a problem here?
Because then tomorrow comes and it's not.
Exactly. And that's the thing. Like when you get those nice days, and I would typically go home in summertime when you're most likely to have a nice day, as opposed to wintertime or whatever else. When it does come, because they're so rare, you really appreciate it all the more.
I'm just thinking back to the heat and humidity in northern India, though, because not being able to cool down because the air around you is so damp and humid. Oh,
yeah, suffocating is definitely the word. Like, so one thing I would do, one of my friends gave me what's called a gamcha. It's kind of like a scarf. You'll see a lot of South Asian men, whether it be in Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Nepal, they have them around their necks. They use them as a towel. They use them to get rid of damp sweat off their brow. So I would soak it in water at one of the petrol stations and then wrap it around my head. So I had this damp thing. Evaporation of the water would cool you down for a little while, or at least maybe even provide like a false sense of relief. Again, you do these little things just to try and get you through. And there's another guy that I take a lot of inspiration from, Alistair Humphreys, a fellow we mentioned before we came on to the recording. And I recall from one of his books, might have been As I Walked Out One Midsummer's Morning, he talks about the challenges of being on a bike tour or any sort of adventure. And one of the ways to manage it, in fact, is like a commonly spoken thing, is how do you digest the elephant? The words he actually used was, all I have to focus on is like the next footstep or the next pedal stroke. I don't need to think about that I've got another 8 hours in these horrendous conditions today. I just need to keep the pedals turned over. You can sort of mentally compartmentalize or break down the day or to like the next stop. I'm going to cycle now for the next 45 minutes and then I'm going to find some shade and like chill out for 5 minutes or something. So you just break it down and take it like one step or one piece at a time. And next thing you know, if you keep that approach, you find yourself somewhere at the end of the day.
Clearly, you found yourself somewhere at the end of the day because you made it all the way there. Although, let's go back to why you missed out on the Gibb River Road. Unexpected things happen on bike tours. Looking at your route, I'd expect that sickness is going to happen somewhere. You're probably going to get some sort of gastro sickness, bad water or bad food poisoning. And some travellers are really unlucky and they get struck with things like dengue fever or malaria, depending on where they are. You, unfortunately, David, had an accident, but it actually wasn't on your bike, was it?
No. And yeah, you're right. And there was plenty of sickness on the trip. Don't worry about that, especially after I left Australia. I got to Broome, so that was the end. So I got through the Tanami track, which was probably going to be the most challenging section of Australia, and went down the Great Northern Highway. Finally found myself in Broome. Had a really nice set of warm showers hosts there, Lisa and Steve, and they welcomed me with an ice cold glass of water. They were seasoned hosts. They had an ice cold glass of water. They said, drink that and then jump in the pool. It's like, yes, please. And what they also had was like this small scooter, like a petrol scooter, like a Vespa. And they were a little bit outside of town. I had hammered pretty hard on the bicycle to get to Broome because I was just keen to get out of the heat and just enjoy some nice time beside the ocean. And that was my first time getting on to what would be, I guess, the Indian Ocean. And Broome, if you haven't been there, like absolutely spectacular, but pretty far away from anywhere. So they said, look, you can use the scooter to get into town. I was maybe a little bit of laziness there because I'd been working so hard on the bike. And I used the scooter a few times. I'd used them before in Southeast Asia, and in retrospect, quite foolishly, because after what I'm about to tell you happened, it made me think, shit, if this happened in Thailand, that would have been a terrible outcome. But anyway, I was driving the scooter around town, and one morning I found that the engine wasn't starting. You replay these things over your head about what went wrong and that sort of stuff. I think that the short matter of truth is that I just don't know how to ride bikes properly. I've never learned. I'm self-taught, and I'm not very good at that, at least when it comes to motorized transport. So I started the motor in their driveway. I revved too hard, and the long and short of it is I crashed the bike in their driveway.
Oh my gosh, hang on, whoa, I didn't realise that part. I knew
Yeah.
you crashed on a scooter, and I thought, oh, that
No,
old
no.
chestnut. In the driveway.
What happened was I was driving along the road, and then this crocodile came out, and I had to swerve past the crocodile, and then there was a shark, and
And then the snake bit the tyre. And
yeah. No, I crashed. I quite embarrassingly crashed the bike in their driveway. I had the handlebar down, and there was a wall and concrete, and I overcorrected, and I basically got thrown off. This is not a big bike. Let me be really clear. You know those like YouTube clips of like people doing stupid stuff and getting hurt? I would be one of those people who did the stupid thing if they had recorded it, but thankfully there is no footage of this event. Although it would be interesting to look back on it. So anyway, I got thrown off the bike, and I put my arm out to support myself, and I guess my whole body weight went through the arm.
It was a bad break.
Yeah, well, in the first instance, I was like, oh, like I've crashed the bike, holy smokes. I ran over and pulled the bike out of the bushes. One of the wing mirrors is off, as like surveying the damage. And in that few seconds to pull the bike up, then, you know, the adrenaline started subsiding, and I can start feeling like, oh, my left arm is not feeling good. It's not feeling good. And as I said before, it's now cooking. It's like 40 plus degrees in Broome. I'm sitting in the driveway, no shade. And I realize I can't bend or move my left arm. So my mobile phone's in my pocket, and I can't get off the bike either because I don't have the limbs required to get off the bike. I sort of reach across my body and try and pull my phone out of my left pocket to call Lisa or Steve to say, I need some help here. I'm in the driveway, but they're inside the house and they can't hear me shouting. So I call them, and I'm like, hello, Lisa. He's like, David, what's up? I'm like, I need some help. You're like, okay, where are you? I'm like, I'm in the driveway. Okay, so she came out, and from her perspective, she came out and she's like, what's wrong? And I was like, I crashed. She's like, where? Here in the driveway. She's like, okay. And I've got a really sore arm. Now, she was an EMT nurse, so she had experience in this stuff, which was really great. She's like, okay, what's your pain level? I was like, okay, if I move it, it's pretty damn sore, like, I don't know, 7 or 8 or something. And she like helped me get off the bicycle, and then I started feeling woozy again because of the adrenaline and the heat. Like, the heat was just beating down, and I started to lose vision. I was like, I need to get my helmet off. I'm trying to fiddle with one arm, and they helped me get. I nearly collapsed basically. And I took a seat in the shade, and I was like, all right, I need to take a second here. So anyway, they got me to hospital, did the x-ray. I broke my elbow, and I did such a good job of breaking the elbow that I needed surgery. And before I heard that news, I was just really hoping soft tissue damage stuff. And they told me the news. I was like, ah. And at that moment, it hit me, the consequence of what had happened. This is going to take some serious time out of the trip. So my heart really sank. I shed a tear. I was just like, oh no. And so then I was like, okay, how long is this going to take? And they said that they couldn't do the surgery in Broome because they didn't have an orthopedic surgeon there. I'd have to go back to one of the capital cities, and it was going to be then surgery and at least 2 months plus recovery. So it made sense at that point to fly home to Melbourne.
When you say you had to go back to a capital city, it's not like Broome's very close to a capital city.
No. The nearest technically is Perth, I believe.
Yeah, I was going to say, was it Perth or Darwin? But yeah, it would be Perth.
Yeah, and the expense of living in Perth, I'd have to stay somewhere. So it just made sense to come home and maybe stay with mum and dad for a bit, which is what I ended up doing. So I flew back to Melbs, and I should also say at this juncture that my partner at the time, Belinda, she did a really nice thing for me. She did because it's not cheap to fly to Broome at the best of times, and it's certainly not cheap to do it last minute either. And she did a bit of a ring around with my friends and did a wee fundraiser for me to help me to pay for my flights home. That really helped take the sting out of that, so I'm really appreciative.
Belinda, you're a legend.
And all of the friends who donated as well. So thank you very much, folks, because it really helped me at a time when I was feeling pretty bummed out, to be honest. So I literally got off the plane in Melbourne. Mum picked me up from the airport, and I asked her if it's possible to go straight to the hospital because I wanted this thing going ASAP. So she took me down to the Alfred in Melbourne. I sat in the ED for probably half an hour before I was seen, and they had a look at the arm, looked at the x-ray, said, yep, you need surgery. They thought they were going to operate on me that day, and in the end I was operated, I think, 2 days later on the Saturday.
Hang on, did you have to go through the horrible thing of each day your operation was going to happen, so you were fasting for an operation each day?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, really, my priority was I want this done ASAP so I can get back on the road ASAP too. It actually wasn't a thing for me. I was like, all right, I'm going to do whatever it takes here, and then once the surgery's done, I'm going to do my rehab religiously, and I want to try and get back to my adventure as soon as is humanly possible. I was super lucky to have the surgery done so quickly, and they did a great job. And I was also like morbidly, I've never been operated on before, so I was morbidly curious about what is it like. Can I fight the drugs that put you to sleep?
No.
No, exactly. And they wheeled me into the operating because, as we discussed before the call, before the interview started, I worked in medical technology stuff. So I was interested, and it was literally like going through a hardware store. I saw them picking out the nuts, the screws from this like set of boxes they were going to put into me. So the whole process was actually quite fascinating for me. Obviously, a bit painful coming out the other side, but again, super lucky to be operated, and we're so lucky to live in a country where we have a healthcare system that allows you, in times of urgent need, it can serve you very well. And maybe not so much if you've got something chronic or that isn't as urgent, then you're on waiting lists and all that sort of stuff. So definitely worth keeping in mind how lucky we are to have what we have and to fight to keep it that way and even improve the services we have.
Oh, massively. How long before you restarted again? Was it 3 months or longer?
Yeah, 3 months. I think the doctors told me they told me initially 8 weeks, but they probably did that because they knew how eager I was to get back on the road. Maybe it was just a little bit of like trying to soften the blow a little bit. It was that I think that was ultra optimistic from anyone, and it was really 12 weeks. I think 12 and a half weeks before I was given the okay.
Did you restart in Australia at all, or did you restart in Indonesia?
So my original plan was to actually finish the Australian leg of the trip in Darwin, and then I was going to try and get a boat. I had this romantic idea of taking a boat across to Southeast Asia, and it can be done, but there are no commercial passenger ferry. There's no like Spirit of Darwin taking you to East Timor, Indonesia. It was going to be getting on a fishing boat or a sailing yacht or something like that, and that process was going to take at least a few weeks, if not 6 weeks. And I've heard of other people doing it now. They've managed to get one way across either from Australia to Southeast Asia or backwards, but it's a process. Because I took a career break to start this thing. It was 18 months. And because I'd wasted 3 months of that time off just recovering, I was like, let's just get back on the roads. So when I flew back to Melbourne, I took my bicycle with me. I made the decision to take it home. And then I flew directly from Melbourne to Bali in Indonesia.
Back on the trail, back you go. One of my initial questions, David, was during that off time, were you still motivated to restart it? But just speaking to you, I can tell not even restarting it would not have been a thing. Like you're super motivated to see this through. And not so much from the seeing it through element, but from the experience element, I think.
Absolutely. Like it was never in doubt as to whether or not I'd be getting back on the road. It was always a case of, okay, how long is this going to take? Like I never for a second thought, oh, is this the end? It was a roadblock. But I do have to admit, it was a pretty big roadblock, and it hit me harder than I expected it to, because I very distinctly recall a moment. I think I was in the Northern Flinders Ranges or just away from them. So I'd finished the Mawson Trail and I was doing this Arkarula loop. Anybody who's been out there will know of this eco resort called Arkarula. It was the first time on the trip when I was really getting into the middle of nowhere, like these huge flat landscapes, like a straight road that just disappears into a pinpoint in the distance. And this is what I mean by the uniqueness of Central Australia. It's just to have that sense of spaciousness and to look at those huge skies and just feel like there's no buildings, there's barely any trees, there's nothing on the horizon that tells you how far away stuff is. And I remember like putting the bike down on the middle of that road, and I was having like a wrap or something for lunch, listening to a little bit of music and looking back at the bicycle and just going, wow, I am here. So it was about 11 years of build up to the trip. So this thing I'd been dreaming about for so very long, now I'm actually out here doing it. And it's not just as good as I hoped it would be. It's even better. Like I was like peaking hard, like just feeling full of ecstatic energy and just really just loving, like, and I'm getting goosebumps now as I say it. To have that feeling of peak living, peak experience, and then to literally crash down to planet Earth via this scooter and then have to return to Melbourne. And the thing was, I wasn't even me. I was a broken version of myself because I'm pretty active anyway. I like to do a lot of cycling, running, calisthenics. I was doing all different things, and I couldn't do any of that really because my busted arm. In the first few weeks, at least, I think it was the first 6 weeks in the end, I couldn't really do much in the way of exercise. So it was really quite confronting mentally. And I ended up doing some counseling around this too. And I engaged a therapist. I did a couple of sessions. I've done it before anyway, and so I knew it could be beneficial. But I just thought, let's just have a bit of a chat here. And it was so incredibly helpful because I expected when I set off on this thing to experience adversity, I expected to have challenges. But what I expected those to look like was flat tires in the middle of nowhere, running out of water, getting lost, maybe in the worst instance, getting attacked by someone or something like this. And I, of course, never wished for that stuff to happen. But I knew they were definitely a possibility. What I didn't expect was to have to return to the very beginning after having put so much space between me and home over that 3-4 months to get to Broome, and then to come back as a broken version of myself. It was a real slap in the face. I wouldn't say I was depressed, but I was feeling pretty low mentally. And the counseling sessions, even just the two of them, and so I highly recommend to anybody out there, no matter what you're experiencing, it doesn't have to be this, it could be any aspect of your life that's getting you down, to engage it if you're able to, because it's so super helpful. The sessions I had, that 1 or 2 conversations just helped me reframe. I hadn't really thought about it in these terms, but maybe in different words. I'd set off on this hero's adventure and I expected these different types of challenges, but I had actually experienced a very different challenge. And it helped me just take a step to the left of how I was looking at the broken arm and reframe it to, okay, this too is part of the challenge. This too is actually now part of the story of what I'm doing. And so when I look back on it now, okay, would I choose to crash the motorbike or the scooter? Absolutely not. But it's a pretty cool aspect of the story now. It's interesting. It's just part of the fabric of the trip. It helped me massively to do that. And I was in much better state then to continue the rehab and push to get back on the road as soon as I could.
Restarting the trip in Bali then, the Southeast Asia part of your journey has started. You know, at the start when I was asking you about the route and how much did you plan it, and you printed out a map and you drew out on paint where you were going to go, did you sort of give yourself milestones? Back to the analogy of eating an elephant one bite at a time. Obviously, in this instance, you're restarting the trip. That's a big deal in itself. But was Southeast Asia also mentally one of your big milestones to get to?
Yes and no. I think when it came to milestones, I had this sort of the broad idea of trying to get through Central Asia before wintertime. I didn't want to be hitting the high Pamirs in the middle of winter, because that would be, if not impossible, very challenging. I did set off with a sleeping bag that was warm enough for minus 12 degrees because I didn't want to be lying freezing on the side of the road somewhere in some pretty high places. But one of the other things I did when I was back home in Melbourne with the busted arm was I bought a couple of maps. I bought a map of Australia, like a big, like 1.5 meter by 1 meter map of Australia. And then I bought another one of the world. And I traced my route on the Australian map, that what I had done so far, like I did my route all the way through Australia. And then I also had the world map there, both as visual reminders of what I had done and what I was setting out to do. And it was above my bed. So every time I'd go to bed, I'd have a look at that map and just go, okay, this is what's next. Don't forget, this is why you're here doing this rehab. And mentally having a rough idea of the countries that I'd be traveling through. So I guess the way I broke it down was into like regions. Australia was a leg. Then you have Southeast Asia. And my plan was to basically fly from Bangkok to somewhere in South Asia. I would absolutely have loved to have gone through Myanmar, but as anybody who out there has tried to do this route, it's not possible. And there was brief windows where it may have been possible, like maybe 2014, 2017. But that country, unfortunately, tragically, has been in conflict for the best part of 70 years. And it's whenever people try and do overland trips, whether it's by bicycle or motorbike or car or whatever, Myanmar, if you're going through the South Asian route, is the big roadblock. I knew after getting to Bangkok, it would be flying to somewhere in South Asia. South Asia was going to be another section. Then getting up into China briefly to cross into Central Asia. Then Central Asia was another section. Middle East was a section. And then, of course, Europe at the end.
Hey there, listeners. Are you tuning in and getting some inspiration for your own bike adventures? Well, here's a shout out to Old Man Mountain, who are supporting the podcast. Whether you're preparing for a weekend bikepacking trip or looking to embark on a longer distance bike tour across continents, to everything in between, Old Man Mountain has a rack solution to fit your bike and suit your adventure. On their website, you will find their handy fit calculator, which will help you choose the ideal rack for your bike. Head over to oldmanmountain.com and get ready to hit the road fully equipped. Okay, back to the episode. Where did you end up flying out to because of that whole Myanmar challenge? What did those countries look like through there?
So I basically island topped my way across Indonesia and then eventually across the Malacca Strait to Malaysia. So Bali, Java, Sumatra. And that's pretty easy going. Once you're in Southeast Asia, getting to places via boat is pretty easy, especially Indonesia.
Pretty lumpy country, volcanic country.
No kidding. That was
You're
confronting.
using those granny gears, right?
Yeah, well, I was riding with a roll-off hub and I was very happy to have the lowest gears because that was another thing about coming home with the busted arm. I was so fit and so strong because my bike had been stupidly heavy, especially carrying all that water and stuff through Central Australia. And I lost so much of it when I was sitting at home with a busted arm. I was pretty green going back into the trip. So I have to admit, in Bali, because I did head up to, once I got away from Kuta Beach, I had my very first outside of Australia warm showers toast in a part of Bali that is lesser traveled, like a very untouristy place. And he was super, super nice guy, Wayan, one of countless people, countless generous, kind, hospitable people I met across the world. But I avoided going up and over. I forget now the name of the volcano, but I was like, I'm just going to stick to the coast, get a few Ks in the legs, and then I'll tackle some mountains. So when I got across to Java, I was in this near the city called Banyuwangi, and I went up to this volcano called Kawa Ijen. It's quite famous for this sulfur pit that if you get there before sunrise, you can see these sulfuric flames. And holy smokes, that was confronting, because volcanoes are like not too steep, not too steep, steep. It's like exponential almost. And I very distinctly recall, like, it was not too bad until it was like, I don't know if I can push this bike anymore. Like, I was literally off the bike now, pushing it by hand, trying to get, and there was a bit of wet on the road because it had been raining, and I was very close to the limits of my ability. And I just thought, I hope it doesn't get any steeper than this, because I don't know if I can push any steeper. And now, of course, what I could have done was then and I did do this a couple of times later on in the trip where it was just too steep. Like, I'm thinking of Tajikistan. There was like this loose gravel road that was super, super steep, so steep that I couldn't push the bike up in one go. So I took the panniers off and did multiple runs. So that's always an option. And the other thing is, I'm not a very strong upper body anyway. Like, I'm a strong from the waist down because I've been cycling now for about 12 years. I forgot to mention earlier, like, after that trip with Tom and Darwin, I started commuting to work on a normal bicycle, and then I got into road riding, and then cycling did become a big part of my life.
Yeah, okay.
So I was pretty strong from a cycling perspective, but upper body, nothing, or almost nothing, particularly after having lost whatever little muscle I had in my left arm.
I've broken my left elbow.
Oh, yeah?
I distinctly remember, David, the muscle wastage, which seemed to happen within like the first 2 days.
It's nuts.
At my forearm, I'm like, there's nothing. I touch it and the muscle was all gone. So I can only imagine what your whole arm would have been like after surgery as well. And
then pushing the bike, and I was like, oh, like, am I pushing the arm too hard too soon and all that sort of stuff? Because the bike's pretty freaking heavy, and you're like basically putting all the force through your two arms. But it was the first challenge. I got up there, and I was like, when I got to the top, I was like, shit, yeah. Like, and I had a can of Coke, and I was like, all right. I got up that first, like, really, and it was a big climb too. I think it was like 1,300 meters or 1,400 meters of elevation. And as you say, Indonesia is a volcanic country, and it wasn't the last that I went up. And I didn't shy away from the climbs either. I was like, okay, like, now it's time to start building some climbing resilience, some climbing strength again. And the other thing is, it was still Southeast Asia. It was pretty hot and humid. Even if you get up like 500 meters above sea level, the climate starts to change dramatically. And the higher you go, the more amenable it becomes. Like, even like, I climbed Gunung Slamet, which is one of the highest volcanoes in Java, and it's up to 3,500 meters. And I camped up maybe at 3,000 meters, and it was cold. It was cold overnight, which is crazy because you're in Indonesia where it's like so like easy most of the time.
That -12 sleeping bag comes into its own.
Totally. Although even then it was probably still overkill because it was like probably like 0 degrees. So I had it open, and I'm a hot sleeper anyway. But
you're Irish.
Yeah, I did appreciate it later in the trip where like I had all the layers on. Anyway, to answer the question, I island hopped my way across Bali, Java, Sumatra, took a ferry from Dumai, a city in the northeast coast of Sumatra, across to Malacca. Indonesia did not let me go easily. That's when I had my first case of bad belly stuff. It was horrendous. Like, I had maybe 200 kilometers across the palm oil plantations and like these literal oil fields of Sumatra. Sumatra is an incredible place, but it's a huge island, but you can also see the industrialization going on. It's just ugly, like palm oil plantations. And then literally you have the oil rigs. Something you'd imagine in Texas, like, couple that with this really bad belly, and it was just hellish. And lots of dusty, dirty trucks spewing like black smoke out the back. So it was a character building finish to a glorious 3 months of Indonesia. I've got to say, by the way, I was made so very welcome in Indonesia. There's this cycling organization called Federal, and they sort of came out around this brand of bikes that no longer exists called Federal MTB. It's just like this huge Indonesian bike touring organization. It's really like a massive community. They're in every major city, if not major town. And once I got on, I found them through this guy, Wayan, this first warm showers host in Bali. And then I was basically handballed from one to the next the whole way through Indonesia. And it was wonderful. But then at the same time, it's like, this is too much of a, like, I feel like I'm on a roller coaster now. I'm on like a ride rather than my independent things. So I did take space every now and again. Anybody who's done the whole staying with hosts, it's wonderful, but you do need time by yourself every now and again. I made sure to get that, especially through Sumatra. So then into Malaysia, I had like some friends in KL, my friends Peter and Pri. It's so nice to have people, once you're away from home, to meet friendly faces again.
Because there is something about reconnecting with people that you do have some sort of relationship with.
Absolutely. And they also spoke perfect English. English was their first language. And so this was the beginning of me starting to try and get some like insight into the goings on, how the workings of countries other than Australia. It was really great to discuss the political situation in Malaysia and understand more about how that country has come to be, like its colonial and post-colonial history and the good and the bad and all that sort of stuff. What I love about this type of traveling is, I guess, first and foremost, the nature. I just love getting to these wonderful natural environments and seeing just the incredible diversity that exists in this planet. But then also the people aspect of it, understanding like, why are human beings the way we are? How have we organized ourselves around the world? How have we got here and where are we going as well? So to start to get those sort of insights. And then at the same time, I picked up a book that also talked about Indonesia's geopolitical history. It was A Nation in Waiting. As I went through other countries, picked up other books about there. So I read this other one called, I think, Silk and Blood, about Southeast Asia in general and the colonial history there and the impact and all that sort of stuff. And so really fascinating, another dimension of the trip. So anyway, up through Malaysia, had an incredible time there. When you're down in the cities and stuff like that, it's not as pretty. But when you get into the jungle, like getting up to the Cameron Highlands and and I also saw some wild elephants in North Malaysia. I didn't even know they had wild elephants, but there's a space which I cannot believe it's not a national park, but there's like a state forest that sort of forms part of the border between Malaysia and Thailand. And I knew there was a good chance I was going to see wild elephants. I talked about this in my preview, yeah.
Listeners, you may have already recognised this as well, but we have featured David for our mini midweek episode. An elephant story is there. If you haven't listened to it, I'll link it in the show notes. You definitely want to, because that's a wild story. Can I just say also, David, you're a brilliant storyteller. Just listening to you now, I could probably hear you share those stories for days and not be bored. It takes me to that thought that your friend, was it you and Tom, meeting in the pub every day for a week, sharing stories? This is what you're doing now. This has come full circle.
Yeah, and like storytelling is definitely important to me. It's as much for me as it is for anybody else, because I love to relive the experience. When I first moved into my engineering work and went from working in a pub job through university, all of a sudden I had weekends guaranteed off basically forever. And that was a novelty for about 5 years. I was like, what? So I have like Friday, Saturday, Sunday, like on Friday evening. And I was doing these weekend adventuring missions. And every Monday I would come back to work, probably a little bit tired, probably having unloaded the car or the bicycle or whatever at like 11 p.m. on Sunday night, but so then full of energy about what I've done and just like ready to talk about it and just tell people. And not so I can brag or make anybody feel inadequate, but to share it, to share the adventure and the experience, and then also hopefully get people revved up about whatever they want to do. It doesn't have to be an adventure, but like get stoked, because there is so much stuff to be stoked about in the world.
But it's learning about it too, like learning about that endless horizon in the middle of the outback. There's an organisation called Federal in Indonesia that if you're bike touring there, you'll want to know about because it's going to be helpful. Like that's what I love about this show, is sharing those stories. But yes, we have shared elephant story, and it's a wild trip in Malaysia. And I have to admit, Malaysia isn't a country that I thought elephants straight away either.
Yeah, I was super surprised and even more stoked when I actually laid eyes on them. So then heading up into Thailand, I had always said to myself, give yourself a bit of island time.
A holiday from your adventure, huh?
Yeah.
Good call. And I think, just like you were saying about speaking to a counsellor when you're feeling low, I think it's a great thing when you're planning a long trip to plan these sort of mini little breaks from the trip.
I think it's a necessity, and it doesn't have to be something luxe or whatever, but just to take some time out from that experience, because there's a level of intensity that you just need a little bit of a break from every now and again. So I really appreciated my stoppages here and there, whether it be like a few days on some islands or even just staying in one place for more than like 2 nights. That was also really nice throughout the trip. So up into southern Thailand, I did experience that part of Thailand where there's meant to be this unrest. I personally didn't see anything because there's like meant to be some sort of the bit of a separatist movement. I saw lots of roadblocks and stuff, but there was nothing going on. And then blazed up to Bangkok. Coming into Bangkok, as with any big city, is pretty yuck. There's just industrialized areas and then suburbs and then traffic and noises, especially after having been somewhere beautiful. So I never really enjoyed coming into any big cities. But because of the Myanmar, not being able to travel through there, I opted to fly to Bangladesh. And I chose Bangladesh because I was like, when else am I ever going to go to Bangladesh? I know almost zero about it. I know it's like a very low-lying country, and that's about it. I'd met somebody else who, on their own journey, it was actually another Irish fellow, actually, Tomas, when he left Australia on his own bike tour, he was doing something similar to me. He flew to East Timor. And in retrospect, I would have flown from Australia to East Timor instead of Bali, because, again, when else am I ever going to visit East Timor unless it's for work? The reason I say this is because I want to go to the lesser travel places and just have a poke around, meet the people and understand a little bit about those countries. And Bangladesh was exactly that. A country I knew very little about, a country that is actually very little visited by tourists. There's not much of a tourism sector there. And what little tourism they do have is probably for other South Asians. So maybe Indians going to this area called Cox's Bazar. They say it's, I think, the longest beach in the world. I actually didn't get to that spot, but I flew from Bangkok to Dhaka. And talk about a baptism by fire. Holy smokes. Dhaka is what I expected every city in South Asia to be. Crazy busy, horns blaring constantly, like filthy, polluted, piles of rubble, just constant congestion, like really lots of smog, and millions of people walking around, busy, busy, busy. In Dhaka, almost every car is fitted with an aftermarket bumper as defensive driving because crashes and bingles are just so common. Like I saw buses that had obviously had scraped a lamppost or the side of a building on the way around a corner so many times and then filled with bog and then scratched again. Like it was just part of how it is. Every car had these bumpers on them. I even saw like an elephant sadly chained to like a highway overpass, just standing there. It's like, why? It was pandemonium. As I say, a baptism by fire. As it turned out, Dhaka was actually the most crazy city I visited in South Asia. Like I visited quite a few Indian cities and none of them held a candle to how nuts Dhaka actually was. So I was like, this is not very nice. It was interesting, but I was like, I hope the rest of the country's not like this. And I actually made a visa boo-boo. I thought that I could actually just cross by land into India. And I got an e-visa for India. And without getting to the nitty-gritty of it, long story short is to enter India with an e-visa, you have to enter by one of the designated airport or seaport. So you can't do a land border crossing on your initial entry.
The complexities of entering a country with an e-visa that it would have this sort of restrictions on it was new to me, and it was only recently interviewing Swedish adventurer Marielle Yaring. Hi Marielle. She had huge issues getting through Russia with an e-visa just recently and not being able to be allowed to exit Russia with her e-visa because she didn't go through a border checkpoint that used those. I never knew that was a thing. So you had this in India.
And this is the thing, visas, I did try and do a bit of homework, and after this experience I was like, all right Dave, you need to get your act together here because you don't want to get caught out again. I was lucky in that I had the cash that I could then, basically I had to fly from Dhaka to Kolkata, and it's crap too because it was like a 300-kilometer flight. It would have taken me maybe 2 to 3 days to cycle that distance, but instead, because I wasn't able to exit Bangladesh via a land border, and I did go to the Indian consulate to see if I could get a paper visa. Long story short, it was going to take a month at minimum, and I only had a 2-week visa for Bangladesh, so I basically had to fly. It was a big pain in the arse, but that's how it goes, and it's prompted me to go, okay, like let's work out your visa strategy for the next 6 or 7 countries, basically through to Europe, actually.
Quickly, David, you mentioned you went through China.
Yep.
I know from interviewing other guests who are going the other way, who are going west to east across through Central Asia, getting a visa to go through China is quite problematic, and not being able to get them unless you're in your home country or you've applied well before. How did you find that visa?
Yeah, a good question. And I also heard about this. There's a few, well, it seems the vast majority of people are going from west to east. There's a lot of people in Europe going to somewhere in the east, whether it be India, the Far East, the likes of China, Southeast Asia, or maybe all the way to Australia, like the reverse of my trip. And there's not as many going the way I went, so from east to west. So this is a quick tip for anybody out there. But there's quite a few WhatsApp groups, cycling WhatsApp groups that I think another bike tourist told me about it. So there's this huge group called Cycling East. I think there's like 1,000 people there now, where it's just all other bike tourists who have or who are currently doing a trip. And it's like a big forum to say, hey, what's the visa like for this country? What's this border crossing like? Is there a bike shop here? And it's a big jumbly mess, but it also is an incredible typically up-to-date resource to find out information like this. So the visa situation is dynamic. But basically, I was very lucky in that, because you're right, China likes you to get your visa in your home country. But that's pretty hard when you're like maybe 6 months away from knowing when you're going to enter China. So you have to pick a date. I was like, well, I don't know. I'm currently in Australia. Like, I don't know how long it's going to take me to get there. I don't know how long I'm going to want to spend in X, Y, and Z. Anyway, I was very lucky because Kathmandu was one of the few places where people who weren't in their home country were able to get a visa for China pretty easily.
I wonder if that's still the case.
Yeah, exactly. As I say, it's dynamic. There was another few problems that didn't affect me because of the direction I was going. I think this is changing now, but China was not looking favorably upon passports that had Pakistan or Turkish stamps in them either. They weren't straight out rejections, but it was certainly putting them into like visa limbo. I'd heard of reports of people having their passports with Chinese embassies in different countries that have been stuck there for 45 days because there was some sort of political argy-bargy going on between China and Pakistan and China and Turkey. And so it was like you're kind of victim of these, like, I don't know, diplomatic. Yeah, I never got to the bottom of it. So
actually, shout out to someone who is cycling west, Claire Wyatt. Hi, Claire. She has made it all the way across Mongolia, China, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, I think back into Kyrgyzstan, then back into Tajikistan. I might have gotten that wrong, Claire, sorry. And right now is battling horrendous headwinds through Uzbekistan. Go, Claire, you're a legend. She's heading all the way back to the UK. So she's heading west. But she also mentioned to me that, yeah, not many people are heading that direction. Everyone seems to be going the other way. And so taking the Premier Highway in that direction meant the first few days for her were horrendously steep because you do all the elevation straight up, as opposed to a lot of people, I think you're gradually building up to it, is what she was saying from that perspective. So it was a bit different.
Yeah, and I did something a bit different as well. So I wasn't on the Pamir Highway, or the part I was on it for quite a short period of time, but I ended up going down what's called the Wakhan Valley. This is like this spit of land between Tajikistan and, well, it's actually Afghanistan, but it's like a really narrow strip of land. Apparently the Brits are responsible for it. So they viewed Afghanistan as like a buffer state between, this is called, I think this is known as the Great Game. What do you call it? Citations necessary for any of the history I'm giving here. So if I'm wrong, please correct me. But my basic understanding is the Russian Empire and the British Empire, they didn't want to be like butted up against each other. So the Brits at that time had India, and the Russians had much of Central Asia. So Afghanistan acted as a buffer state between the two empires. They basically invented this Wakhan corridor that stretches right up to the border with China. It's just this geopolitical entity that's just quite bizarre, and it literally follows this valley. So when I cycled along there, it was such an epic time. You're looking across at 5,000-6,000 meter peaks. I think it's the Hindu Kush. That's the name of the mountain range we're looking at, in addition to the Pamir Mountains. And you're like, that's Afghanistan. And I was there in autumn. It was so beautiful because
the leaves.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, reds, oranges, bright yellows. And then you have this like otherwise very dry, arid landscape. And then these like massive tumbling rivers down in the valleys below you. So that was super special going down there. The thing is, my route was definitely not direct. This is why I call my trip the long way home, because I'm taking the long way. It wasn't about getting anywhere fast or as efficiently as possible. It was like a meandering journey, and mine is definitely not the most meandering that I've come across. I've seen people do many, many loops and back, forth, up and down, left and right, but I definitely did not take the most direct route. And certainly when it came to Central Asia, I did like sort of several S-bends basically. And so in Tajikistan, I went down the Wakhan corridor and then up the Bartang Valley. So there's 3, if not 4 valleys that people would typically be cycling up. And the Bartang is the lesser known of the 3 or 4, whereas the Pamir Highway is the most commonly taken one. And the Bartang too was excellent and hard and remote, especially once you get away from the villages. And then you end up on this like big sort of plateau in the northeast of Tajikistan where it's, you're at really about 4,000 meters and getting pretty chilly at nighttime because, I was there in November-ish time.
Oh, yeah. So around now, like that's cold.
Yeah. It was, I had some in fact, I remember one particular night, I realize we're bouncing around here a lot, by the way, but...
No, I don't mind. This is the best part. I always start a show with a question flow, but we go on an adventure, and I love it. Go on.
And again, anybody who knows me knows that when we're having a chat, strap in and be prepared for many tangents.
David, I'm going to be cheeky, and I'm going to say, if you're up for it, in a few months' time, I'd interview you again, because I'm going to get different stories, and I love hearing them. So, yeah, anyway.
I would definitely be up for it.
Done. Virtual handshake. We get to look forward to it, listeners. Anyway, keep going.
So yeah, I remember I was on the Bartang Valley route, heading up towards, what's this town called? Is it Murgab, maybe? In Tajikistan, you're really getting, it was probably the most remotest I had been since being in Central Australia, especially having come through China and then South Asia, which is just humans everywhere, humanity everywhere, humanity overflowing, basically. My stove had not been doing so well. It had been puttering in and out. I have one of these multi-fuel stoves, like liquid fuel. Like I had an MSR Whisperlight International, which is great because this one takes the gas canisters as well as the screw-on butane propane mixes. So this one allows me to use those canisters if they're available, in addition to then changing the adapter to kerosene, petrol, and shell-out or white gas. And it had been, I think because I'd put so much dirty petrol through it, it was starting to clog. Internet was not very good in Tajikistan. It was probably the place where I had least good signal, if at all. And I remember this one night, it was the same day that I had to push up that mountain road where it was just so steep and so loose that I had to do multiple runs to get the bike up first and then come back for the bags. It was hard yakka, but incredibly beautiful. And just like looking around you, like, where else would you want to be doing something like that? Got to the end of that hard day, and it was, during the day, it was okay, like nice and sunny a lot of the time, and temps are good. But at nighttime, the temperatures plummet. And that's when I was stoked to have my minus 12 degrees sleeping bag.
Comes into its own now.
And I was trying to get the tent set up, and I was losing feeling in my fingers, not for the first time or the last time on the trip. Because I had mitts and I had gloves and all that sort of stuff, but you need a bit of dexterity to get the tent poles and all that sort of stuff going. And every maybe few minutes, I just couldn't feel my fingers anymore. So then I had to quickly stop, go down on my hunkers, and I would put my fingers between my calves and my hamstrings to essentially defrost my fingers to get enough feeling back to do the fiddly bits again. So it was like, quickly set up the tent as quickly as you can, get some water from the little stream that's mostly frozen beside me, and then got into bed, all the layers on, into the sleeping bag. I'm like, all right, let's start to build up some warmth, time for some dinner time. And of course, the stove isn't working. The stove has finally given up the ghost, and I can't cook. I had like pasta. I was ready for like a big hot meal and some tea or something, and I couldn't do it. So I was like, oh no. So all I had for dinner that night and then breakfast the following morning, because I was in the middle of nowhere. I couldn't buy it. There was nowhere to buy food. And even being in that part of Tajikistan, buying food can be a challenge at the best of them. Is pretty slim pickings. What I had was some pretty stale bread and a can of tomato paste. And I'm a bit of a weirdo in that I like tomato paste by itself anyway. I wouldn't have it as a meal, obviously. But
Hang on, we're not talking tomato sauce. We're talking tomato paste.
Yeah, the paste. Like, if you're making
like concentrated paste, and you put like a tablespoon or two in and make it
exactly. So that was my dinner, dipping this dry steel bread into this. This time it wasn't by choice. It was because that's all I had. But I would maybe have like added dip stuff in the past, but like again, always a little nibble, not as the main event.
No oregano.
No, nothing. So it was bare bones, and it was a bit miserable, but I had something to eat, which I was very grateful for, because to go to bed on an empty stomach
at that elevation.
Yeah, it was hard too. You're definitely feeling the altitude. I'm in my tent having this dinner of royalty, eating my stale bread and tomato paste, thinking, is this a low point or is this going to be a high point? Looking back on this thing, and freezing too. Like I had everything on that night, because I reckon the temperature must have plummeted with the wind chill and all that stuff down to like minus 15 or something like that overnight. But then woke up the next day, beautiful blue sky, and also the just incredibly epic mountains off in the distance, because the Pamirs, when you're up there, like you're kind of on like this plateau, and then it's flanked, depending on which valley and whatever that you're in, you can see these like super high mountains that are glaciated and like spiky peaks. So basically at that point of the journey, I was now making my way into Kyrgyzstan. So again, talking about the visa and then oftentimes border issues, there was different things going on at different times. But when I was there, this particular border crossing between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, Kizilart Pass it was called, had just been sort of, I say sort of because there was no official statement on this, but it had been open to foreigners, not to local people. No idea why this was. I think there was a bit of border argy-bargy between the two countries at one stage in recent years, but you had to do this weird process. You had to grease the wheels, I reckon. I don't really know. You basically had to pay 25 or 30 US dollars to someone who knew somebody to get your name on a list that when you got to the border, they would let you cross into Kyrgyzstan. And it was initially free, and then by the time it got to me crossing there, the price had gone up to $30, and you had to do it through some person. Anyway, I paid the money, my plan was pay them at the border, but I got my name on the list, or so I thought. It was a bit of a long, slow climb up to maybe 4,800 meters to get across this border. Again, no snow. You can be so lucky or unlucky with this stuff, because I'd heard of people being there like a week or two before and there had been a lot of snow. On the Tajik side, there was barely any snow. And then on the Kyrgyz side, there was a little bit of snow, but nothing crazy. Talking about Soviet/Russian sphere of influence, this is why Central Asia fascinated me so much. I wanted to see this part of the world that seems to be a lot lesser traveled and experienced. You kind of behind the Iron Curtain a little bit, not anymore, of course, but like to see like what that was like. And you have this like real mashup of culture. So Central Asian culture, and within that, there's obviously different ethnicities. You got your Kyrgyz, you got your Tajiks, your Kazakhs, your Uzbeks, your Uyghurs, and it's like this real mixing pot of different peoples. And empire after empire has basically rolled through this region because it's like a crossroads of East and West. And the Soviets were just the latest in a long line of people who'd done so. And then to see the impact of that, so this mix of Silk Road Islam with somewhat modern communist way of doing things. And so, for example, even though it's still predominantly Muslim, alcohol is like part and parcel of the culture there, whereas in many other parts of the Islamic world, alcohol is haram and a big no-no. But my assumption is because of like the Soviet influence, where there was a lot of what I guess were effectively Russian colonists coming to Central Asia and setting up different industries. They're bringing the alcohol side of things. So alcohol was very much part and parcel of life there, and very cheap too, actually. $4 for a bottle of vodka. I'm not a big vodka drinker, but when in Rome.
I've heard it's really impolite to sort of knock an offering of something like that back. Like if you're going to do something like, and you don't want to have it, like at least act like you're sipping on it.
Yeah. And look, not to play into the stereotype too much, I am Irish. It wouldn't have been the first time I've touched a drop.
You're not having it with orange juice there.
No, it's straight up. That's the thing. And they drink fast too. Like I find myself having more than a couple of shots of vodka in quick succession with randomers I met along the road. And I'll say this with a big old caveat, or like keep the head on, be aware of who you're with, the feeling, the energy of the people you're with, your exit strategy if you need one. Like don't just go and get drunk with random strangers you meet in the road without any forethought. But I will say this, I got through my 2.5-year journey without a single super negative. I say super because I had a few like iffy experiences, but I was never attacked. I was never robbed. I might have been taken advantage of financially in some way, paying like foreigner prices. I feel kind of okay about, because the global north has been literally robbing the global south for the best part of 4 or 5 years, if not longer. But I never had any challenges. But I've heard of other people who, firsthand, who have had bad experiences. I think it's partly luck of the draw. I think it's partly the energy you bring into the world, but that's not to blame the people this has happened to. But just be aware. But it can also be really fun. I remember in Uzbekistan later on in the trip, it wasn't a very pretty part of the Central Asian leg. It's the Fergana Valley is highly industrialized. It's one natural disaster, ecological disaster after another, because you probably heard of the Aral Sea,
yes,
which was a sea and is now pretty much a desert, because all the rivers that flowed into that were then diverted into like cotton plantations, because cotton was a big part of the Central Asia economy during the Soviet times, and probably still is today, I believe. But that sea now has basically dried up. Entire villages have had to be abandoned because they lived off the fishing that they got from the sea, and now it's gone. And the Fergana Valley is quite ugly and industrialized, and the water and the rivers are all polluted, and it's just like, it's not pretty. But cycling through there, like I found a lot of good hospitality in Uzbekistan. So I remember one particular evening, pretty chilly too, because now we're well into late November. So at nighttime, even during the day, it's cold. Like if it was in the middle of the day, I wouldn't stop. But if it was towards the end of the day and people flagged me, hey, come on over, what are you doing? And I'm like, why not? It's almost quitting time, These old dudes were at like this little road shack and come in, sit down. And a lot of it was like Google Translate conversations. Google Translate made these sort of experiences and interactions a lot easier than they would have been in the past. But I did find myself at other times where I didn't have the internet or the right language on my phone, and it was down to miming. You always get by. It's very easy to communicate your basic needs, but it's harder, obviously, then to have a deeper conversation. And on this occasion, the lads, it was like a granda dude. He was like, we're sitting across the table, and then they had the other guys around, like asking questions and taking selfies, and some like sort of meaty, stewy soup thing appeared on the table. And then the first bottle of vodka appeared, and I was like, hey, we'll have a shot of vodka, no probs. And I don't typically drink straight vodka, but I did on this occasion and a few times in Central Asia. And before I knew it, that bottle was gone, and then the next bottle appeared on the table. So I think in the space of about...
My head's already banging.
Yeah, I was like, I'm going to be pretty rubbered here. And I was. And Granda across the table, I guess this is a common occurrence for him. He seemed to be grand. We were like, all right, let's home. And he's like, so where are you staying tonight? I was like, I was just going to camp. He's like, oh, you can stay with me, no probs. And he seemed, and this is what I said, like about the energy of people. Like a big part of it is your gut feel. Like, how do you feel about this person? And he seemed like a nice guy. He actually had a bicycle too, which is great. So he then cycled to his house, which is only like another kilometer or two up the road. Like he had a small farm, and it was him and his wife. And then there's, as is often the case in certainly Central Asia and other parts that I travel through, everybody sort of lives beside each other. So then he had his sons and daughters in another house next door, and I was half cut at this stage, sort of like I'm, cycling back to the house, and it was only a short ride, and got there, and then parked up the bike, and then I was a guest, and as was so often the case, I was treated like an absolute king. Like it just, my every whim was being catered to. Sometimes it felt like too much, but by this point, I was pretty well seasoned into receiving hospitality. And I think when you're on the road like this, because you're receiving so much of it, sometimes you feel like, am I being greedy here or whatever? But you have to remember, for the people who are giving it to you, you might be the first person they're doing this for in a week or a year or something like that. At least from their end, you're certainly not taking advantage, and it's okay. I find it really hard, and I think other people do, especially from the West, doing this sort of stuff, struggle with the wealth inequality that exists in the world, and also just the generosity that you receive from people. So this really first started for me in Indonesia, but then probably Bangladesh was the poorest country I went through, and that was one of the places I experienced some of the most common and most generous hospitality. This weird inverse relationship between the more you have, the less people seem to be willing to share, and the less you have, the more people are willing to share. So the trend for me was more poor countries and Islamic countries, people were more generous and hospitable. And it's just incredible because they know, like, I'm not rich in Australia, but compared to them, I am rich.
Sometimes you're in places where they don't have a passport even. Like, their ability to cross the border isn't there.
Yep.
And you're doing that. You're well above the wealth spectrum that they could ever imagine to be.
Totally. And you're right about the passport stuff. There was a few times where the people I met who were kind to me also asked me if I could try and get them out of the country. And I certainly wasn't in a position to do so. And it's hard because, like,
that would be difficult. Yeah.
I can't blame them for trying to better the situation. Again, talking about what I call the birth lottery, just being born in the West.
Hey, awesome listeners. Are you loving what you're hearing on Seek Travel Ride? Do you want to keep the good vibes rolling? Then head over to our Buy Me a Coffee page and show your support for the podcast. Just a little virtual caffeine love can keep me brewing up the content which you adore. Click the link in the show notes, buy me a virtual coffee, and let's keep this podcast party going. Thanks, legends. Now back to the episode.
Do you ever feel racks of guilt about the disparity in the situation?
Absolutely, and all the time, especially through poorer countries, as say Bangladesh, India, because there's such a stark contrast between rich and poor there. You'll be in a big city with glistening steel glass skyscrapers, and then maybe literally next door there's slums. There's like people sleeping under like shanties under a tarp, and people just sleeping on the road, and kids begging on the street. It's absolutely heartbreaking to see these people who are in such dire straits. And you give some money, of course, if you can afford it, but it just feels like such an overwhelming problem. How do you fix this? And then you hear things like, okay, like for example in India, and I don't know how much truth there is to this, so take it with a grain of salt, but it sort of factors into whether or not you give. I've heard that in some cities in India, like Calcutta, gangs, organized crime, basically put kids on the street. They take them out of school to put them on the street to beg from strangers, from foreigners and locals alike. But then, is that a story that rich people have told themselves to not give money to people who need stuff? As soon as you give to one child, then another 10 comes around you. And it's like, well, what do you do? I think where I settled with it was give what you can. And if there's a bit of dishonesty there, I'm willing to wear that. I obviously don't want to make the problem worse, but I'd much rather give than not give. I just want to, because I've received so much generosity. And this is one thing I really want to say as a takeaway from my adventure was I experienced such an incredible amount of kindness, generosity, friendliness, and just common humanity from people across the world in every country, even in the rich countries. But it was most common in poor countries and Islamic countries. And that goes so heavily against what the picture that is often painted, particularly against Islamic countries in the news. And what I'm not saying is there's no bad people out there. There's bad people everywhere. I could get robbed in Melbourne. If anything, I actually felt, and I don't know if it was my own mental state, but I felt coming into the West more wary of having the bike stolen or something like that than I did in many of these other places like Central Asia, Middle East, South Asia for sure.
I was actually going to ask you, what was it like when you did cross over into the West?
Well,
How did it feel for you? Like, was that a reverse culture shock?
yes. Well, I actually kind of experienced it in Central Asia to an extent too, because when you go to the capital cities there, whether it be, so I went to Bishkek, the capital of Kyrgyzstan. I was in Almaty in Kazakhstan, and some of the other bigger cities there, Shymkent, Samarkand, the capital of Uzbekistan, places like that. And they're almost like Eastern European cities. You go from like these crazy wild places like the Pamirs, and then come into a big city, and there's KFC and McDonald's, and like people running around on like, the Uber delivery drivers, and there's cars everywhere, and it's just like any big city. So I kind of got a taste of like Europe again, or what felt like Europe then, before diving back into like, then I went into the likes of Turkmenistan, often described as the North Korea of Central Asia.
How did you get in there? Because I thought Turkmenistan was hard to get into.
I'll tell you a story. This is a good one. So visa-wise, it was not a problem. You just go through an agency. I found the name of some reputable agencies through that WhatsApp. Again, that resource was incredible. It was not cheap though, because at the time, so since COVID, there was a time, and I think it's now the case, they would give you what's called a 5-day transit visa, which was just enough time for a bike tourist to do the 500 odd kilometer straight across the country from Iran to Uzbekistan or vice versa. Since COVID, they had not been giving out that visa. And when I was there, they were still not doing it. So the only option was to do, I think it was just called a tourist visa, but you had to have a guide. I didn't cycle through Turkmenistan. I actually took a train across the country, and it was not cheap. And then I snookered myself again because I had to change my dates, blah, blah, blah. But in the end, I think it cost me something in the order of 360, maybe $400 for my visa and then my tour guide. So I was in the country for less than 48 hours.
That's a big hit for a bike traveller.
It was a real sting in the tail. So the guy was going to meet me at the border with Uzbekistan, no probs. Crossed from Uzbekistan, had the bike. He helped me with the paperwork at the desk. And then the plan from here was he was going to take me home, and I had an overnight train booked from, so I was in Dashaguz, a city in the northeast on the border, and then I was going down to Ashgabat, which is the capital in the south, and then going to just cross into Iran. So the guide picked me up. He was a nice guy. He even did some extra stuff. He showed me some of these. Turkmenistan is full of these crazy monuments. It's a very rich country, very resource rich, oil, gas, and other stuff, and a tiny population, only like 3 million. And it's basically been a dictatorship since the fall of the Soviet Union, sort of like supreme leader sort of craziness. And he's obsessed with white marble. I think he's died now. Now it's his son. But it's just like blue tinted glass and white marble monuments. Google Turkmenistan monuments and you'll see some of the craziness I'm talking about. So anyway, the guide picks me up, takes me home. We've got about 4 hours to kill until this train leaves. And I thought he was coming with me at this stage, but it turns out he was going to drop me to the train station, and then somebody was going to pick me up at the other end. So he says, just chill out. Even the internet there is blocked. It's like, like a firewall and all sort of stuff, and the VPNs weren't working. So I went for a wee snooze, was just chilling, And the guide was, I don't know, he disappeared to pick up his kids from school or something. And he came back about, I think it was 4:30. And I was thinking, well, I don't know how far away this train is, but we probably want to get on the road soon. And we talked about getting some kebabs before I got on the train, because the food in Central Asia was not that good. But one thing that was good was the shashlik. Holy smokes. Think of like shish kebab, so like meat on a skewer. Anytime they'd had meat otherwise, it was in a stew or whatever, it was always under seasoned, and it was just like not that good. But for whatever reason, especially in the likes of Uzbekistan, and as I learned in Turkmenistan, the kebab is like next level tasty. It was seasoned beautifully. You have these big hunks of beef. Sorry to the vegans and vegetarians out there, but beef or lamb or whatever. No pork, of course, because we're still sort of Islam. Then also big hunks of fat that was all seasoned, and like when it's cooked on this like open like charcoal, I'm salivating thinking about it. And the guide said, well, we do pretty good kebab here. And I was like, okay, well, let's go there before I get on the train. So that was the plan. So he came back from whatever he was doing. He said, do you want to have a cup of tea? And I was like, well, do we have time? He's like, yeah, we got time. So I had a cup of tea at the house. Then he took me to the kebab place. So again, I think the train, let's say it was leaving at 6:00. We get to the kebab place at like 5:35, and you order the kebab and they cook it for you. Like, it's not like there's kebab just and they shit, like they're cooking it on the coals. There was a wee bit of a queue. I was thinking, well, I mean, I'm paying this guy to get me to the train, so that's his responsibility. Ordinarily, I'd be like, all right, I got to make sure I've got time, blah, blah, blah. And I do like to cut things down to the wire anyway. I think I get like cheap thrills from like, rushing to trains and airports. Anyway, 10 minutes later, the kebabs are finally ready. Now it's like, well, maybe not even 10 minutes. I think it's 5:45 now. The train, remember, is leaving at 6 p.m. It was getting short. And I was like, I'm guessing the train station's not far, because this guy was cool as a cucumber. So we get in the car, and I've got a bicycle that's partially disassembled to get onto the train.
Which is never fun at the best of times,
No,
anyway.
and now it's rush hour, so because all the cars are coming home from work, and I can start to detect a little bit of panic in the guy because he's like accelerating and then slamming the brakes every time I hit a light or like some traffic and congestion, and he's going around all these back roads up and over bumps and stuff. I was like, all right, I think this guy's starting to shit himself. And I was like, so we've got time for this? He's like, yeah, we'll be okay. But I think I could, internally, he was like sweating it. So now I was thinking, okay, if I miss this train, I'm not paying anymore. I'm already paying a lot of money to get for this service. So this is on them, but I'm going to try and make the train. So I'm thinking mentally, okay, where's my Allen keys? What do I need to do? I'm going to get the bike at the car, quickly put the wheel on, put the bags on, and then blaze to the train. So I think we got to the train station at like 5:54. The train's leaving at 6. I did that. I assembled the bike very quickly, and I said, look, man, I'm going to cycle to the train. You grab the bags. I'm going to find out where my carriage is, where I put the bicycle, because I knew sometimes that's like the biggest part of getting on This train is huge. It's like a kilometer long. 30 carriages or something ridiculous. And I'm like, I'm led to the conductor, where did I put my bicycle? He's like, oh, down there. So it's at the very other end. So I blazed down cycling. And by the way, if this is the West, they'd be like, you're not allowed to cycle on the platform. You have to walk your bicycle. But thankfully...
Yeah, could you imagine doing it in Melbourne?
Yeah, like they'd have a heart attack. So
no!
Blazed down to the cargo carriage. Fortunately, there was a guy there who helped me hoist my heavy bicycle onto the train. Grand. And then I'm starting to walk back because my seated carriage is like number 10 or something. The other side of the train, basically. And the guide has my bags. I've got my camera hanging off my shoulder. I've got another bag of food in the kebab, which I haven't eaten yet. And I even bought a cheeky bottle of cheap vodka, which I forgot that I was not going to be able to bring into Iran because alcohol is legal there. And anyway, so I'm walking back. I see the guide ahead of me. We sort of catch up with him. He's like, "Did you get your bike on?" I'm like, "Yeah." And I was like, "Wait a second. The train's moving." The train had started taking off.
Oh my gosh. This is a movie scene.
You couldn't write it. This is literally like a scene from a movie. So the train is slowly moving the opposite direction that I'm walking now. I'm like, oh shit, I need to get on this freaking train. So now I'm running to wherever my carriage is, and the train is picking up speed. And the guy's like, you gotta go. And the conductor who had asked before about where to put the bicycle is like, hey man, get on the freaking train, basically saying that. And the train is now going at like a reasonable clip. So I started running with the train. Again, I've got my camera hanging off my left shoulder and grabbed an arm and kind of leapt, and just like, it's literally like a movie scene. And like, I managed to get one foot on, thankfully, and the bags and the camera swinging widely, and the conductor grabs my hand and pulls me onto the train. And like, my heart is going, like, and I'm like, holy shit, like, what was that about? Like,
you've still got the kebab?
The kebab is in the bag. Thankfully, I had it. The conductor said to me, he saw the bottle of vodka. He's like, you can't drink that. I was like, oh man. So like, this vodka was going to waste. I later gave it to my guide on the other side in Ashgabat. And the guide who got me to the train station just kind of watched helplessly as I sailed past him. And I was like, thanks, man. Thanks for that completely unnecessary drama. But again, it's a good story, and it was a bit of fun in the end.
Oh, absolutely. David, can I just say, I always ask my guests to share one day of their trip. You've already done that on our little mini episodes, but this is so one day of your trip on this show. That is when 15 minutes feel like a full day.
Yeah, it was hectic.
Yeah, I could imagine. I mean, that's just one example of 2.5 years worth of days. I'm mixed at skipping ahead because there's so much that's happened from Turkmenistan and arriving in Iran to arriving in Cushendall. But I'm going to skip ahead on the benefit of knowing you and I are going to record again, and we're going to record the missing gaffes here because there's so many stories to tell. How could I not? I want to take you to Ireland, though. And you had 3 weeks on the West Coast travelling, discovering your home country again, that coming home journey. The long way home's almost there. What was it like slowly coming back to your village and seeing sites that possibly you were familiar with growing up in Ireland as well?
So I was initially under a bit of a time deadline, and there still was one. So because if you recall earlier, I was saying that I had a career break and I had like an 18-month time period off. I had already extended that at least twice, I think it was. And I had also booked some flights home because I was like, okay, the trip has to come to an end at some point, and I don't want to be booking this last minute. It's going to cost me a fortune. So I got a pretty good deal on some flights, and I had a date. And of course, every time you say, oh, I'll just stay for another day, or I'll just, because there's always a reason to stay and explore, and there's always something else to check out. And when you get towards the end of the trip, this stuff, of course, finally stacks up. Like all these little extras finally culminates in you being like way behind where you thought you were going to be at a certain time. And I tried not to have deadlines, but the flight was probably like the ultimate deadline. And I knew I had the chance to change it if I wanted to. And I had, in fact, already changed it once. So getting again, like, the Pyrenees and all that sort of stuff before taking the ferry to Ireland. I was like, I just want to have a little poke around here. And I still didn't have nearly enough time to explore those places. So I arrived off the ferry in Ireland. And at that time, I think I had only like 8 days or 9 days, maybe it was 10 days to get from southeast Ireland to northeast Ireland. And I wanted to see some of the west coast. I also had family dotted around Ireland. I had family in Cork. I had family in the north. And then I had to somehow get myself to London to fly home to Australia. Anyway, what I'm saying to you is it was all coming to an end all too quickly. I was like, this is nowhere near enough time. So I looked at the flight change again, and I literally paid more than double the original flight price to change it. So that was a bit of a sting in the tail, but you know what? I have no regrets about that, because just giving myself, I think I extended it. So then I had an extra 2.5 weeks or 3 weeks, and it just made me, it allowed me to have this extra time to just really wind down the trip. Because of course, as anybody who's done one of these, when you get close to the end, there's definitely a type of grief you experience. It's a big transition period, and sometimes you feel like I want it to be done, and other times you're like, I could go on forever, or I don't want it to finish yet. Getting to Ireland was both amazing, but also a little bit sad at the same time. And
bittersweet.
Yeah, bittersweet is absolutely the word. But it just gave me the space to like go through that transition period, having that 3 weeks. So it was so, so nice to then explore a bit of the motherland. Because I left when I was 17. I've been back many, many times over the years, but never had the freedom, and certainly never had my bicycle with me to just, scoot around the country. And it's small and big at the same time. Like north to south, I think Ireland's like 600 or 700 Ks. But if you follow the coast, like you might have heard of the Wild Atlantic Way.
Oh, I love it. I got to experience just a small section of it when I lived in Ireland. A really small area from Galway, cliffs of Moa. And I've experienced Connemara before and things like that too. But, it's a bucket list for me to go back and see Ireland properly on a bike. The only way, right?
Totally. Well, I mean, be prepared for the rain, of course. But I think the bike, it's the freedom machine, and you just experience the world so very differently than other types of travel. So I kind of started the Wild Atlantic Way because I'd given myself, when I finally, because I was like, doing a lot of soul searching, I had this job to go back to. And in my last conversation with my manager to say that I'm coming home, I actually found out that I was getting made redundant. So I now all of a sudden didn't have a job to go back to and didn't have that deadline. I also was running out of cash, as you can imagine, 2.5 years on the road. And now I'm back in the very expensive West. Fortunately, I got a bit of redundancy money, so that meant I didn't have the same sort of financial pressures as well. So all of it culminated in me having the time and money to, wind down the trip in a way that I wanted to. And going up the West Coast was just, seeing family was so much fun. Like I saw my auntie and uncle and cousins down in Cork. It was so much crack, and, I had a few pints of Guinness, and just we explored, and just so great to see familiar faces, and the first of many that I would be seeing as I headed further north. The island of Ireland's about 600, 700 Ks north to south. If you do the whole Wild Atlantic Way, which starts in sort of southwest Cork and finishes in Donegal in the very north, it's like 1,500 kilometers, maybe even 2,000 kilometers. I'm trying to remember now exactly, but it's way more.
I think it's about 2,000.
Yeah, 2,000. So basically, there's a lot of peninsulas and a lot of like very jagged coastline that means that it blows out to way more. And so I did about 1,000 Ks of that, from basically starting in Ennis in Clare, going all the way up the west coast to Donegal, and then the northeast coast as well. And it was magic. And here's the thing. Okay, Ireland doesn't have the biggest mountains in the world. It doesn't have the hottest or coldest climate. It doesn't really have the extremes of anything. And I'm not saying this because I'm biased. I think it's genuinely true. Ireland is just as beautiful as anywhere else I experience in the world. And especially, there's a lot of fields, which can be a bit boring, but the coastline hasn't been tamed. You can't. And you just, especially that west coast, these huge sea cliffs, like the Cliffs of Moher, of course, but then...
Oh, massive. And then, is it Sleeve
League?
Sleeve League, that's it.
Donegal. Yeah. Apparently the tallest, I don't know what this means, but the tallest accessible sea cliff in Europe.
Good on the Irish.
Yeah.
And then you've got the Giant's Causeway.
Yeah,
come on.
Absolutely. But even North Donegal, like Malin Head, incredibly beautiful. Donegal is like really wild and hilly and lots of wind, but it's super beautiful. So I had a really wonderful time in Ireland, and I always found a pub towards the end of the day to go in and have a cheeky pint, but also just have a chat, because it's a great place to meet people. And they're all, if you see the bicycle again, it's like this conversation starter. Who's this person? Where they come from? And the thing is, now I'm at the end of my journey, and I find myself going, I'm cycling from Australia to Ireland, and then having to correct myself and go, I have cycled from Australia to Ireland. I'm on the home stretch. That 3 weeks was a really wonderful time to consolidate and start to process the fact that I'm coming to the end of my journey. And then getting into Cushendall. So It's great. So there's a couple of lads, shout out to Fergal Lynn and Dominic McAllister. They do this thing on Facebook, like they do a Facebook Live like once a fortnight or something called the Old Boys Youth Club. So it means like the Old Boys Youth Club. And it's just basically two old men, or not even old men, they're not even that old, I think middle aged, but like nattering away, gossiping about the latest whatever in the village. And it's great for like, especially people who don't live in the village anymore to hear about the local crack, the local gossip. There's a pothole that hasn't been fixed for 6 months. There's going to be a road closure. What are they going to do with the Glens Hotel that's been closed for, donkeys? And mentioned to me became a regular feature on this thing. Where's David now? Because David McCourt, he's cycling from Australia to Cushendall.
Oh, I love it. You're the proper local celebrity.
At least on this Facebook Live thing, it was like, funny, and people were always like, getting updates. Oh, he's in Iran now. He's in some Saddam Hussein's castle. A story for the next episode, I think.
Definitely.
So a little teaser there. Then they arranged, or Fergal sort of gave the village a bit of rev up about me coming home, and so we coordinated with the day I was going to get there. And so there was a good crowd of people there to cheer me on coming into the village. I get goosebumps now thinking about it. I had tears. I had all sorts of emotions. And I also had one of the most brutal headwinds coming across from Ballycastle. Like, it was killer. Like, it was like the trip didn't want to let me go. And then also bittersweetness because sadly my poor Uncle John Scully, he was on his deathbed. So he had terminal cancer for about 2 months in the lead up to me finishing my journey. So I knew he was dying, and I was very lucky to get to see him before he passed away. And then I was also there for his dying and then for his death. And also, this is my mother's brother. So my mom also flew home at short notice to be with John before he died, and all the siblings came home. So it was really bittersweet because my mom was there at the finish line. She wouldn't have been there otherwise. So I got to have my mom at the finish line. She was there to greet me. We had a big hug and a few tears. And then I was able to go to the house and be there for my family and for my uncle as he passed away. And then for the wake and the funeral and all that stuff. So it really came together quite beautifully. And I mean that with great sincerity. Like, it was a very profound thing to, as my mother said, like, me and John were both coming to the end of our own very different journeys. I was coming to the end of this epic adventure, and he was coming to the end of his life in quite a sad way, but also surrounded by friends and family and lots of love. So it was bizarre how life works out sometimes. It can just be, it seems like everything's coming together exactly as it should. I felt that a lot on this journey, not just at the end, but there was many times where I just felt like life is, the way I think about it, life is unfolding exactly how it needs to. And sometimes you can resist that flow of life and it gets a bit harder. And other times you can just be sort of going with it as you feel like you need to. And it just seems to be, and what I'm not saying there, by the way, is like life is going to be easy. Life will still throw challenges and curveballs and all that sort of stuff. But I think it's about how you tackle it that is the thing that makes a difference and makes it feel like more or less of a struggle.
Yeah. You know how Cushendall, it was coming home, and it's a small village, Northern Ireland, obviously very meaningful for you. I have a little bonus question, which I've actually got from my super lovely father-in-law. Hi, Frank, who grew up not far from Cushendall. In fact, you both went to the same school, which was like a really weird fact that I found out. Which is
Tar.
Yeah, exactly. And he wanted to know, was there any time during your journey over this 2.5 years where you came across a small village or anything which actually made you think and remind you of Cushendall?
Oh, a good question.
Frank only asks the good ones.
I've got to say, like, when I was 2 places, in Kurdistan, Iran, so the Kurdish region of Iran, and I was just shocked by how green it was. I was there for spring, basically, and just these beautiful rolling green hills. And then also Kurdistan in Iraq. So I was in Kurdistan, Iraq. And then later, you've probably experienced this region, so Basque Country, French Basque Country and Spanish Basque Country.
Totally, 100% there with you.
It could be
the green rolling fields.
Yeah, it's so lush and so green and is basically the same as Ireland. So I was very much reminded. And then also in Basque Country, there's lots of teeny tiny villages. And obviously they're speaking Basque, so it's not quite that. And it's like you got the Spanish and French and Basque cuisine stuff going on. But I was definitely reminded of what Ireland was like. And then it was interesting to finally get there and actually see, oh yeah, it was similar. It's different in these sorts of ways. So that's the one way in which I experienced that on the trip.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, David, we have chatted for so long. And as we've both said, there are more stories to be told. And I'm going to be excited to share them for you as well. People are going to follow you, find out what you're up to, where you've been, scroll through your photos. What's the best way that they can follow you now? And how can they learn more about your journey?
Absolutely. So my Instagram handle is longwayhome 2022. I think it might be longwayhome _2022.
I will post a link to your Instagram in the show notes.
So I was doing Instagram stories and Facebook stories across the journey, but of course I disappeared after a day. So I've started doing posts to summarize every few days of the trip, and that's like an ongoing project for me. I'm also going to be doing a live presentation through Off Course Bikes. That's going to be at Inner North Brewing in Brunswick on the 4th of December. So Wednesday, the 4th of December. Doors open at 6:30 p.m. and we'll probably kick off about 7. And I'm going to talk for about an hour and a half, and then we'll have a question and answer session after that. I think that's the main ways. If you want to get in contact with me, send me a DM on Instagram. I'd be very happy to answer any questions, direct you to those WhatsApp groups I mentioned, because they're such a wonderful resource. And I love talking to people about the trip. I love hearing other people getting on their own trips, because I love spreading the stoke. Like, we're so very lucky to live in the world that we do, and also live in the countries that we do, that gives us the financial freedom and passport freedom to go on these adventures, which then takes me to the other aspect of the trip you mentioned before, that I was raising money for the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre. Can I include a link to my fundraising page if that's okay?
1,000,000% totally on board with
So
that.
I'm super passionate about this because, again, we won the birthplace lottery by being born in Northern Ireland and Australia. And there's so many people in the world that are born in places and then grow up and live in places where they're either persecuted because of religion or ethnicity, or live in dire poverty or experience war. And I completely understand why they want to flee these places to try and make a better life for themselves. And the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre does incredible work supporting people seeking asylum in Australia. So I'm raising money for those guys, have a fundraising target of 10K. I think I'm up to about 7 or 8K. So I'd love to see us get to the 10K mark as part of a wrap up of the trip.
Let's kick it along, everybody, and I'll provide a link to that in the show notes as well. David, this has been such an incredible time. I have 3 super short questions to ask you, which is my way of saying we're not allowed to go round the world in answering these ones.
Okay.
The first one's music related. As a guest of Seek Travel Ride, you get the honour of having a song added to the Seek Travel Ride music playlist, a playlist consisting of one song chosen by every guest to be the soundtrack to their adventure. What are you going to choose?
Great question. And music was a big part of my adventure. And I'm going to choose a song that was actually passed on to me by my friend Tom. He listened to it on his bike ride around Australia, and I listened to it many, many times myself. It's Keep Your Head Up by Ben Howard. It's a song that is there when you're feeling a bit challenged by whatever is happening around you on these sorts of trips.
It's a perfect song for the playlist, which, listeners, I've created a brand new one because Spotify has locked me out of my old one, leaving me the inability to add songs to it. So you'll see the whole collection up there as a Spotify option, which will link to the podcast, and that will have everything, and it'll be over 5 hours long of eclectic music to get you going for your longer rides. All right, David, final 2 questions. You're given a choice one day, and you can spend the whole day pedaling forever on an endless, undulating, rough and bumpy corrugated road. Or, alternatively, you get to spend the day into an endless, brutal, almost stop you in your tracks headwind. Which one are you going to choose?
Definitely the first.
The corrugation?
Yeah, like the dirt roads are always they just take you to more interesting places. It's challenging, of course, but like you're looking around you and going, there's probably not buildings, there's probably not much in the way of humanity. You're on this dirt road because it's plunging you into the heart of some sort of natural beauty. So definitely the first.
It's like the Oodnadatta Track corrugations. So even with those corrugations, you're still going that way.
I don't know how much it worked, but I bought a suspension seat post saddle, specifically for the corrugations. I bought it and installed it after Alice Springs because I knew I was going to have some hard times ahead of me. I think it took a bit of the sting out of the corrugations. And the thing with the bicycle is there's usually, not always, but there's usually somewhere you just find like a tiny slither of track on the very edge that hasn't quite been, because the corrugations are made by trucks and cars and stuff like that. So you spend hundreds of kilometers like weaving back and forth to try and just find a tiny sliver of uncorrugated stuff.
Which is really how you take your tour, isn't it? Like weaving, snaking back and
Absolutely.
forth. So taking the long way on the corrugations. All right, you're on Team Corrugation. Final question for you, David, and this is a relatively new one. Actually, you're the first person I'm asking this one to. I want you to finish this sentence for me. The best thing about taking a bike adventure is...
Let me have a quick think. I'm going to say, as a short answer, the spaces in between. The places that you only typically experience because you're cycling. That's the absolute beauty. Yeah, you can visit the Taj Mahal and the Eiffel Tower and all that stuff. And I did that and it was amazing. But just as equally exciting, and maybe even arguably more so, is all those random encounters and interactions and just the experiences you'll have with people in places that almost never see people from other countries. That for me has been like probably the biggest gift of this way of traveling, is to have those sorts of experiences. And they're ones that I'll never forget. And then you find yourself being welcomed in, treated with such kindness and generosity, exchanging culture with people, understanding their way of lives and comparing it to your own. And they want to know about what life is like in your country, and sharing a meal. And this is the thing, for all the like, there's so many ways to be a human being. There's so much diversity in the world: culture, ethnicities, religions, languages, and food, and all that stuff. And it's so true. But then at the same time, what I took away from the trip was there's this beautiful common humanity amongst all of us. We're all at some level the same. We go to bed and then we wake up in the morning, we have jobs, we have homes, we have fathers and mothers and families, and we fall in love and we get married or not, and children, and we all have to share a meal. Like, there's nothing more human, I think, than sharing a meal together. Like, it's such a privilege to be able to do that with so many different people. So that's why I think bike travel is the way to go, and the spaces in between reveal all of that to you.
I love that. I love every element of that. And do you know what else I love? Because it's just typical you, and I've gotten to learn about this in the 2 hours or so that we've been chatting, is that your short answers, you always find a way to have a really long story with it too.
Sorry.
No need for apologies, David. I have had an absolute ball just listening to you. Honestly, David McCourt, it has been an absolute pleasure to be able to learn about you, your stories, your motivations for taking this journey, how you overcame adversity, and learning so much about those places in between. I feel like you've given me an extra gift of travel. I have gone on a journey of wanderlust myself, taken me back to Cushendall, and this time the toilet block will be open. But honestly, always which to say, just that passion and energy that you tell your stories with, I can see how much this trip gave you energy and how much purpose it's given you with all those experiences and those encounters with those people, sharing a meal, from the craziness to Dakar to managing to catch the train in Turkmenistan to everything in between. Thank you so much for sharing your stories and experiences here on the podcast on Seek Travel Ride.
Thank you so much for having me, Bella. It's an absolute pleasure, really, really an absolute pleasure for me to relive these stories, especially now that I'm home and sort of working out what comes next. And I'd also like to finally say a massive thank you to absolutely everyone, the countless strangers and friends and family alike that have treated me with such kindness, openness, hospitality, generosity, and just common human decency. Like, I appreciate it so very much from the bottom of my heart. So thank you.
Well, listeners, what an incredible journey we have all gone through there. Listening to just a few of the beautiful stories that David has shared with us. We talked a lot before we pressed record, and so this session felt extra long already, but time just went so quickly because David shares it with such passion and enthusiasm. I could really feel the hot, humid oppression that he would have felt in northern India. And also I could feel his despair when he broke his arm and when he talked openly about the mental health battles that he had, but having to put his journey on hold there. And then also another thing that I really loved about David was the idea that sort of trust your instincts with people, to allow things to happen, but also be aware of the situation, trust your instincts, and know what's happening around you as well. David and I have committed to doing another session with him, which will go into the other places that he went to on his long way home, so keep an eye out for that. Now, listeners, I am super excited because in just 1 week's time, we are sharing episode number 100 of Seek Travel Ride. That is 100 long-form guest interviews of bike travel all around the world, all different types of bike adventure. People like David who've gone from Australia to the other side of the world, people who've toured through continents, through countries, people who've challenged themselves in the toughest ultra cycling races, and everything there in between. And I am excited to say that our new show sponsor, Old Man Mountain, has provided an incredible prize pack which will be given away to one lucky follower of the show. This prize pack will give you a full touring setup to take on your own bike adventures. That's front and rear rack, 2 sets of panniers, as well as an extra bag. your bike will be fully equipped to take you on any adventure that you choose, whether that's off-road, on-road. One thing you'll be certain of is that your equipment will not let you down there from Old Man Mountain, because they are built to go through everything and yet stay nice and silent too. Now, to enter the competition, it's quite simple. Just check out our Instagram page, which is at Seek Travel Ride, and you will find the details there on how to enter. Good luck! And until the next episode, episode 100, I'm Bella Malloy. Thanks for listening. And that's a wrap on today's adventure. Before you head off, here's a final shout out to Old Man Mountain for supporting the podcast. If you're dreaming of a new bike adventure or mapping out your next big tour, you want to make sure your gear can keep up with you every pedal stroke of the way. Old Man Mountain racks are built to handle any terrain you choose, from rough off-road trails to smooth highways, giving you reliable, stable carrying power that frees you up to focus on your adventure. Check out their full range at oldmanmountain.com and start gearing up for wherever your next journey takes you.